Hey, glad you're here. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of a world both hidden and harsh, the secret rhythms of intimacy in medieval Europe. This wasn't an era of candlelit seduction and courtly charm. It was a time of communal beds, whispered rules, and love tangled in law and guilt, where passion had to tiptoe and desire lived in the shadow of sermons and suspicion. Still, behind every rule was a workaround. Behind every silence, a story. And that's what we're here to explore. If you enjoy drifting into these forgotten corners of history, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it genuinely adds something to your night. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this little circle of stories reaches out across the world. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's trace the quiet secrets that lived behind shared curtains, stone walls, and centuries of silence. There is a myth we like to believe about the past, that the intimacy of the medieval world was cloaked in velvet, candlelight, and privacy. That it happened behind closed doors, under embroidered sheets, with just enough modesty to satisfy both romance and religion. But the truth is far less graceful. In the homes of the majority, peasants, tradesmen, and small landholders, there were no separate rooms, and often no doors at all. A single-room cottage might shelter an entire family, parents, children, grandparents, a visiting cousin or two, maybe a farmhand, and certainly the family's animals. The kitchen, bedroom, and barn were not distinct places. They were zones within the same living space, partitioned by habit more than walls. Imagine trying to navigate love, lust, or even basic affection in such a setting. There was no turning down the lights. There was no locking the door. There were only moments, stolen, silent, and rarely comfortable. In these spaces, intimacy was something that required coordination and a fair amount of creativity. Timing mattered. So did volume. A couple might wait until the children were asleep, or pretend they were, before sharing a blanket and praying no one stirred. Sometimes a family might hang a thin cloth between beds to simulate privacy, though everyone on either side of that curtain knew what was going on. Sometimes even that luxury was impossible. Beds were expensive. Many families slept together in a large pile of limbs and straw, wrapped in whatever fabric they owned. Privacy was not a right. It was a luxury reserved for the very rich. And even they were often never truly alone. In noble households, servants slept at the foot of the bed or stood quietly in corners, pretending not to see. Intimacy was public, even when it wasn't supposed to be. The idea of the private bedroom, the idea that a couple should have a space of their own to share a moment, a breath, a life, did not truly exist for most people. And so intimacy had to find its way into the cracks of communal living. It had to be hidden in silence, wrapped in cloth, and carried out with the practiced awareness of who might be listening. This wasn't just about modesty. It was survival. Communities were tight-knit. Gossip traveled fast. And one careless sound in the night could become the morning's entertainment. For couples who were married, it was an inconvenience. For those who were not, it could be disastrous. What often gets forgotten in romanticized histories is that shame was a kind of architecture. It shaped the way homes were built, the way families interacted, the way affection was expressed. It was a force as real as timber and stone. And within its narrow frame, people did what they could. They found ways to be close. They whispered. They waited. They risked embarrassment. Because even in a world where everyone watched everyone else, the human need for connection didn't go away. It just learned to move quietly, in the dark, behind a curtain that never quite closed. Even in the quietest corners of a medieval village, behind shuttered windows and beneath woolen blankets, one presence was never far away: the church. Its influence reached into kitchens, fields, and most intimately, into the bedrooms of its people. It was not content to rule the soul alone. It laid claim to the body as well. Physical intimacy, though natural and necessary, was never entirely private under its gaze. Every act between husband and wife was subject to judgment. The church taught that marital relations were acceptable, but only within strict guidelines. They were not to be enjoyed too freely, too often, or for the wrong reasons. Pleasure was permissible only if it arrived by accident. Desire was something to be disciplined. Love, even within marriage, had to make peace with guilt. And so, as a couple might prepare to share a moment of closeness, they would do so with the full weight of theology bearing down on their breath. Sermons didn't just mention morality, they detailed it. From the pulpit, priests explained which days were forbidden for intimacy: Fridays, Sundays, saints' feast days, Lent, Advent, and others too numerous to remember without a calendar. Failing to follow these rules was not merely a personal failing, it was a sin. Some church manuals instructed confessors to ask newlyweds how often they lay together, in what manner, and with what intention. The assumption was not that people would fail occasionally. The assumption was that they would fail often, and that each failure was a step away from grace. The goal, according to many medieval theologians, was not to love your spouse joyfully or even consistently. It was to fulfill a duty, ideally without smiling. This did not mean that people were emotionless or unfeeling. It meant that affection had to be carefully navigated. The church often portrayed physical love as a slippery slope, a crack through which sin could enter a household. Even the order of affection mattered. A husband was to love his wife, yes, but never more than he loved God. A wife was to submit to her husband, but never to her own desires. Passion, if it existed, had to be cloaked in restraint. It is easy to think of this as cold or cruel. But for those living within it, this moral framework was not a choice. It was the air they breathed, the structure of daily life. They internalized its expectations, repeated its teachings, and confessed its violations in whispers behind the altar rail. And still, despite the scrutiny, despite the guilt, despite the endless cycle of confession and restraint, people loved. They reached for each other when they could. They broke rules quietly. They carved out slivers of closeness in a world that constantly tried to deny them that grace. The church may have watched everything, but it could not stop the human heart from wanting. And so, across the centuries, beneath layers of doctrine and discipline, love continued, awkward, anxious, and utterly persistent. To make love in the medieval world was to navigate a calendar full of spiritual traps. Every month carried warnings. Every week had boundaries. There were rules about when you could touch your spouse, and they weren't just suggestions. They were etched into sermons, manuals, and the conscience of every pious couple who feared for their souls as much as their reputations. Sundays were off limits, of course, the Lord's Day. But so were Wednesdays, Fridays, and the vigils of major feast days. The days leading up to Christmas were prohibited. So were the 40 days of Lent. So was Advent. And on top of all that were the many lesser feast days honoring saints, martyrs, and relics. If a couple wanted to remain righteous, there were whole seasons where desire was expected to disappear entirely. What remained were a few scattered windows, Tuesdays in April perhaps, or the odd Thursday in September. And even then, the act was supposed to be modest, restrained, and always with the possibility of new life. Behind this intricate moral timetable was a theology that saw physical pleasure as dangerous. The church taught that the body was weak, unreliable, and easily led astray. Too much enjoyment, even within marriage, could corrupt the soul. Intimacy was supposed to serve only one purpose: procreation. Any other intention, emotional closeness, affection, comfort, was suspect. Marital unions were to be practical, not passionate. Some bishops even warned that engaging in intimacy on the wrong day could result in sickly or cursed children. The stakes were not just personal, they were cosmic. The rhythm of the heavens was to be mirrored in the rhythm of the bed, and woe to those who dared to improvise. But human nature rarely fits so neatly into sacred boxes. Couples bent the rules, they broke them, they confessed, they bargained. A quiet moment behind closed shutters could feel both forbidden and necessary. And for many, the fear was not just about sin, it was about being seen. Neighbors could gossip, priests could ask questions. A wrong word, a slip of the tongue, could lead to weeks of public shame or whispered rumors that never died. So even those who believed in the rules still had to learn how to hide from them. Love became something stealthy, something negotiated in silence, one eye always on the calendar, the other on the door. This wasn't a world without affection. It was a world where affection had to fight for space. Every embrace was shadowed by fear, every kiss had consequences, and yet people still found their way to each other. They still made room for love in the margins. Because even in a society that tried to regulate the heart, the calendar could not stop it from beating. There is a strange sort of intimacy in the noise of a one-room home. The crackle of fire, the snoring of children, the soft cluck of a hen who refuses to leave her corner of the floor. In medieval Europe, privacy wasn't simply rare, it was unknown. And yet somehow, within this cluttered domestic orchestra, couples still managed to connect. The space in which they did so, however, was nothing like what we imagine today. No candlelight, no locked doors, no silk sheets or whispered tenderness under moonlit rafters. Instead, there was straw that scratched your back, a child coughing in their sleep, and the knowledge that your in-laws were less than 3 feet away. In this setting, intimacy was something you attempted with one hand on your spouse and the other covering your mouth to stifle any sound. Curtains, when they existed, were not decorative. They were essential, hung from beams, strung across makeshift rods, or tacked against the low rafters of a peasant home. They formed the illusion of privacy, but everyone knew what they were for. Children knew, elders knew, neighbors who passed by the window at night knew. A curtain did not muffle the squeak of a floorboard or the weight of a body shifting against the wall, but it did allow couples to pretend. And in a world where pretense often carried more weight than truth, that was enough. You did not need perfect silence. You needed plausible deniability. You needed to avoid being noticed, or at least avoid being talked about the next morning. Animals added their own dimension to this fragile dance. Chickens were common roommates. Goats slept near the hearth. Dogs curled under beds. And while they were largely indifferent to the behavior of their human companions, they were not quiet. A goat knocking over a pot at the wrong moment could make a couple go rigid with fear. A chicken's sudden squawk might draw a curious child's attention. And there were stories, half joking, half serious, about animals acting as divine witnesses to human sin. Whether or not anyone believed them, the idea added another layer of discomfort to an already awkward process. For young couples, especially newlyweds, this lack of privacy could be crushing. There was little space to learn each other's bodies, to speak softly and share affection without interruption. Some waited until the household had fallen deeply asleep. Others arranged errands for the family to buy a few stolen minutes. But there were always risks. A child who woke at the wrong moment. A mother-in-law who wandered to the fire. And in noble households, where servants were ever present, the situation was no better. One chronicler described the queen's maid pretending to sleep beside the royal bed while scribbling notes on the behavior of the couple beneath the sheets. No detail was too small to be reported, and so the curtain remained, not as a shield, but as a gesture, a silent agreement between those who wanted privacy and those who pretended not to notice when it was broken. In the medieval world, a bed was not a private retreat. It was a shared, multi-purpose zone of sleep, storage, sickness, birth, death, and when fortune allowed, moments of intimacy. But it was rarely, if ever, a space reserved solely for two people. Peasant homes, even those of moderate comfort, typically contained a single sleeping area for the entire household. Children were piled in by age or temperament. Aging parents, widowed relatives, visiting cousins, and even farmhands found space where they could. And when livestock needed warmth or protection, they too joined the pile. A family's bed might be an enormous wooden frame filled with straw mattresses, shared linens, and limbs pressed shoulder to shoulder. A couple's desire to be alone was not just unlikely, it was often impossible. Even among the wealthier classes, privacy was tenuous. A noble couple might have their own chamber, but that chamber was rarely empty. Servants attended them, sometimes around the clock, ready to stoke the fire, fetch water, or respond to the call of a bell. In royal courts, it was not uncommon for entire retinues to be present as the lord or lady prepared for bed. Pages, chambermaids, scribes, bodyguards, each with their role, each silently observing. Some would sleep at the foot of the bed, others stood by, facing the wall or pretending to nap. And though their eyes may have been averted, their ears were not. What occurred in those chambers was not just heard, it was remembered, repeated, and occasionally recorded. For married couples, these arrangements demanded not just discretion but strategy. Intimacy had to be brief, silent, and well-timed. They had to calculate who was nearby, who might be listening, and how much noise the bed might make. Even then, there was no guarantee that their efforts would remain private. A creaking floorboard could wake a child. A servant might stir. And if the moment coincided with a forbidden date on the church calendar, the consequences could move beyond embarrassment into outright guilt. Every sound risked a cascade of repercussions, from gossip to confession, from suspicion to public penance. Social expectations added further tension. A couple was expected to fulfill their marital duties, but not to appear overly indulgent. Excessive affection, even within marriage, could be seen as a moral weakness. It was a strange paradox. To love too little was failure. To love too much was sin. Many medieval guides for married life advised restraint, encouraging couples to approach the act without joy, without delay, and preferably without interruption. But how exactly was one to manage that with 3 children on the mattress and a goat nosing through the hearth ashes? The bed, then, was a stage where love played out in whispers. It was where the private collided with the communal, where human desire had to navigate tight quarters and tighter expectations. It was not romantic. It was real. And within that crowded frame, couples still found ways to touch, to connect, to feel a moment of closeness before morning scattered the illusion once again. In a medieval village, the walls were thin, the ears were many, and the silence between events was filled with the rustle of speculation. Nothing stayed hidden for long, not the borrowed cup of flour, not the late-night footsteps, and certainly not the occasional sounds of human closeness echoing through beams and stone. What people did in the dark was never entirely their own. Intimacy, even within marriage, became part of a public ledger written in glances, rumors, and the low murmurs that filled parish halls and market stalls. For those who slipped outside the bounds of what was acceptable, whether by time, passion, or circumstance, the real punishment was not divine wrath. It was the eyes that lingered too long, the silence that followed when they walked into a room, and the whispered questions that never needed answers. In such a world, guilt had company, and shame was never solitary. Confession was supposed to be the place where such burdens could be lifted, but in truth, it often made them heavier. Medieval confession was not the quiet, general act of penance we imagine today. It was a detailed, intimate reckoning. Priests were instructed to ask specific questions about frequency, position, motivation. They wanted to know not just if a sin had occurred, but how, when, and with what intent. The confessional became a space of spiritual intrusion, where the sacred duty of penance was tangled with social oversight. If you confessed too vaguely, the priest might press further. If you were too honest, you might leave with more shame than you entered with. And while confession was supposed to be private, the priest still lived in the village, still knew your family, still delivered sermons that could sound suspiciously pointed. The weight of this guilt varied from person to person. Some absorbed it fully, seeing themselves as fallen or flawed. Others resisted it inwardly while complying outwardly. Most did what they had to do to survive both spiritually and socially. They confessed when required. They repented on schedule. And then, when no one was watching, they returned to their lives and their loves, quietly hoping that God at least understood. For unmarried couples, the stakes were even higher. A single accusation, sometimes without proof, could result in fines, forced marriages, or public punishment. For women especially, reputation was fragile currency. A misplaced whisper or a jealous rival could undo years of quiet discretion. And once your name was spoken in the wrong tone, it was difficult to ever retrieve it. And yet, despite the pressure, people still reached for one another. Love did not vanish under surveillance. Desire did not dissolve in shame. Instead, it adapted. It found the silent hours. It used coded glances and back entrances. It wrapped itself in secrecy, not because it was unclean, but because it was sacred, and the world would not allow it to be sacred out in the open. In this way, medieval intimacy was never just about closeness. It was about risk, about who knew, about what they might say. For all its supposed holiness, the act of confession in medieval Europe was often more surveillance than salvation. It was not just about the soul, it was about control, about drawing boundaries around behavior, marking who belonged within the lines of acceptability and who did not. Priests were not neutral listeners. They were guardians of doctrine and discipline. And when it came to the matter of intimacy, particularly anything that drifted outside the church's narrow prescriptions, their questions were precise, probing, and often deeply personal. To enter the confessional was to step into a quiet courtroom, one where guilt was assumed and innocence had to be proven through shame. The questions were not vague. Penitential handbooks circulated widely among clergy, guiding them on exactly what to ask and how to interpret the answers. These manuals listed sins in exhaustive detail, especially those related to carnal behavior. A priest might ask a husband if he had approached his wife during a holy day. He might ask a wife if she had expressed too much enjoyment. He might ask if the act was performed face to face, if there was any deviation from what was considered natural, or if it occurred in a manner that could not produce children. Every variation had a name. Every name had a penance. Some confessions must have felt more like interrogations, with the confessor's curiosity masquerading as concern. And yet, to refuse confession was unthinkable. It was an essential part of religious life, a requirement for communion, a step toward grace. People confessed because they had to, because to die with unconfessed sin meant risking eternal damnation. So they spoke, sometimes truthfully, sometimes strategically. Some people minimized, others embellished, and a few deflected with convenient forgetfulness. But everyone understood the game. You had to say enough to seem honest, but not so much that you invited discipline or judgment. It was a performance as much as a prayer. The irony is that while the church claimed to be safeguarding morality, it often ended up knowing far more about its followers' bedrooms than their daily sufferings. Priests recorded these confessions. They categorized them. They used them to preach, to guide, and occasionally to gossip. In smaller villages, where the priest might be a neighbor, a cousin, or even a family rival, confession was not always a shield. It was sometimes a weapon. One poorly guarded secret could become the talk of the tavern, disguised as a lesson from the pulpit. Despite this, many continued to seek the confessional not because they trusted it, but because they needed to believe it offered something beyond the judgment of neighbors. They hoped that in the quiet dark, beneath the whispered prayers and rote questions, there might still be grace. And maybe, for a few, there was. But for most, it was just another place where love was reduced to lists and where the truth of their lives had to fit within a script someone else had written. There was no such thing as a neutral touch in the theology of medieval Europe. Every gesture, every embrace, every intimate act was measured against a scale that had been calibrated not by lovers, but by priests. According to the church, there was a correct way to engage with your spouse, correct in purpose, correct in posture, correct in attitude. And anything that veered from that narrow path, even within the sanctity of marriage, was suspect. This moral script was not whispered or implied. It was written, preached, and enforced. Manuals for confessors laid out approved practices in blunt, unflinching terms. Passion, spontaneity, even joy could become liabilities. In a world shaped by divine hierarchy, even the body was not exempt from regulation. At the heart of this doctrine was a singular rule: intimacy was only justified if it aimed toward procreation. Love that existed for comfort, for pleasure, or for emotional closeness was, at best, tolerated. At worst, it was condemned. The missionary position, man above, woman below, was deemed the natural order. It mirrored not only the supposed biology of reproduction, but the spiritual hierarchy of man over woman, humanity under God. Anything outside of that, anything involving novelty, equality, or mutual exploration, was viewed as unnatural, even sinful. These views were not limited to theologians. They filtered down through sermons, confessionals, and the everyday teachings of local clergy. For generations, they shaped how couples thought about their own bodies and desires. This rigid framework led to some truly strange and tragic consequences. Married couples, longing simply to express affection, had to second-guess their instincts. A moment of closeness might later become a source of shame. If one partner initiated with too much enthusiasm, it could be interpreted as lustful. If both showed enjoyment, it could be cause for confession. And if the act occurred on the wrong night or in the wrong way, it risked being labeled as offensive not just to the church, but to God Himself. Some couples developed strategies to navigate these expectations: silent agreements, coded language, or the occasional denial of memory in the confessional. Others, more devout or more fearful, tried earnestly to follow the rules. For them, intimacy became a sacred obligation wrapped in anxiety. The disconnect between human desire and theological ideal left many trapped in confusion. Love was supposed to bind marriages, but only if it kept to its assigned lane. Expressions of affection were permitted, but only with restraint. A woman who showed too much desire could be labeled as immodest. A man who sought pleasure too often could be told to pray for chastity. These messages weren't just moral, they were internalized. They became part of how people saw themselves and how they measured their worth within their marriage. Even in bed, there was a hierarchy, and God was watching. Still, despite the restrictions, people found ways to love. They adapted. They remembered the rules when they had to, and forgot them when they needed to. The church may have drawn the lines, but behind closed curtains, couples found ways to color outside them. There's a particular kind of sorrow that lives in silence, the kind that takes root when something joyful must be treated as shameful. In medieval Europe, passion between married couples was supposed to exist only in the narrowest of margins. Not too much, not too often, not on the wrong day, and certainly never with enthusiasm. Even the mere act of enjoying physical closeness could lead to uneasy questions in confession, strained prayers of repentance, and, in extreme cases, official reprimand. Passion, though natural and common, was never celebrated. It was policed. And in at least one infamous case, it was formally condemned by a bishop who believed that a couple's affectionate behavior within marriage had become spiritually dangerous. His suggestion? That they redirect their passion into prayer, that they learn to love not through closeness, but through chastity, that they remember, always, that too much desire, even for your own spouse, was not a blessing, but a burden. This was not just a local eccentricity. Church authorities across regions produced treatises, letters, and instructions outlining what they considered to be excessive behavior. The boundaries were rarely clear. What one confessor tolerated, another condemned. What passed in one village might scandalize the next. But the principle was always the same. Physical love should be quiet, limited, and ideally stripped of pleasure. A couple who truly wished to honor God would approach each other with restraint, with solemnity, and without laughter or longing. The more devout might even vow abstinence within marriage, a practice called continence, which was praised as a form of mutual holiness. In such unions, love was measured not by intimacy, but by its absence. The legacy of these teachings ran deep. They reshaped how couples viewed themselves, each other, and their shared lives. Husbands wondered if their affections made them weak. Wives feared that their desire marked them as impure. Some tried to follow every rule, calculating when they were allowed to be together and performing the act more as a ritual than as a connection. Others found themselves in quiet rebellion, breaking the rules but carrying the guilt. The church's presence was never far. It hovered over the bed, sat quietly in the corner, whispered in the conscience, and called out from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. It told people not to feel too deeply, and when they did, it told them to confess. Yet human nature rarely fits into theology's neat boxes. Couples still loved each other. They still reached for hands in the dark. They still found comfort, laughter, and relief in one another. And while they might carry that affection into the confessional, they often did so with a strange defiance, a belief that their connection, even if frowned upon, was worth preserving. Behind the church's silence was a world of quiet passion, lived in secret, whispered in kitchens, confessed in part, but rarely abandoned. And so love continued, not because it was approved, but because it was real. In the medieval world, love was not the foundation of marriage. It was, if you were lucky, a byproduct. Marriage was first and foremost a contract, an agreement between families, a calculation of resources, and a negotiation of futures. It involved livestock, property, status, and reputation. It was a tool for forging alliances, settling debts, or keeping peace between neighbors who had quarreled over land boundaries or accusations of stolen chickens. A wedding was not the culmination of romance. It was a transaction sealed in public, witnessed by the community, and blessed by the church to keep everything, souls, lands, and inheritance, in their proper place. Courtship, as we understand it today, was an indulgence few could afford. For peasants, the terms were usually practical. A man might offer a pig, a patch of farmland, or a sturdy ox as part of the agreement. A woman might bring linens, chickens, or a coin dowry collected over years of labor. Suitability was measured in tools and temperament. Could he provide? Could she work? Would their union produce strong children and hold steady through winter scarcity? These were the questions that shaped decisions. Not whether they made each other laugh or whispered sweetly under moonlight, not whether their hands fit or their thoughts wandered to each other at dusk. Those kinds of feelings belonged to songs, not real life. Among the nobility, things were more elaborate, but no less transactional. Lords arranged matches for their daughters to secure borders or win allies. Kings married off nieces and cousins to foreign courts to avoid war or gain political leverage. Women were moved like chess pieces across maps, their value tallied in acres, gold, and the purity of their bloodlines. Many noble couples met for the first time on their wedding day, already pledged in the eyes of God and law. Whether they liked each other was irrelevant. The union had already done its work. Affection could come later, if at all. Even the church, which insisted that marriage be entered into with consent, rarely interfered with arranged matches unless they violated canon law. In practice, that consent could be little more than a whispered yes between a daughter and her father's expectation. Women who resisted a match could face pressure, isolation, or worse. Men, too, were sometimes bound by alliances forged by fathers and grandfathers long dead. Marriage was too important to leave to emotions. It was too sacred and too strategic to be shaped by something as fleeting as desire. And yet, within these arrangements, some couples grew fond of each other. Love did happen, not often, not easily, but sometimes over shared work, shared grief, or quiet years spent together, a kind of trust took root. A partnership formed, but it was not expected. It was a bonus, an accident of fortune, the kind of thing no one counted on, but everyone quietly hoped for. Before vows were spoken or hands were joined, before a priest muttered blessings or a community gathered in celebration, there was the dowry. It was the foundation of most medieval marriages, not an afterthought, but the first and often most decisive part of the union. A dowry was not simply a gift from the bride's family. It was a statement of value, a transfer of wealth, a promise of legitimacy. It could include coin, livestock, clothing, tools, bedding, or parcels of land. In noble families, it might mean entire estates, political promises, or rights to a contested riverbank. For the peasantry, it might be a milk cow, a small chest of linen, or the promise of help with seasonal planting. The dowry said, "This woman is being given with something to her name, and that name must be protected." It wasn't just about economics. It was also about security. A dowry helped ensure that a bride would not be cast aside lightly. If a husband grew tired of his wife, the threat of returning the dowry, or compensating for it, could temper his impulse. In some cases, the dowry would be returned to the bride's family if the marriage ended without children or was annulled. In others, it would remain with the husband unless severe mistreatment could be proven. These rules varied by region, but the logic remained consistent. The dowry gave the woman a kind of shield in a world where few protections existed. But make no mistake, it was the marriage that made her respectable. The dowry only got her there. The negotiation of a dowry was often long and complex. It could involve fathers, brothers, uncles, priests, and village elders. It was not unusual for matches to fall apart over disputes in value. Was the land too rocky? Were the oxen too old? Was the girl's family overstating her worth? These discussions could go on for months, even years, particularly when the social stakes were high. A good dowry could elevate a family's status. A poor one could lock a woman out of the marriage market entirely. And in some cases, a generous dowry was used to offset a flaw. Perhaps the bride was older, or had few physical charms, or came from a family with a troubled past. The deal could be sweetened. Everything had a value, even reputation. For the woman herself, the dowry was a strange burden. It was both her ticket into a new life and the price of her departure. It reminded her and everyone else that she was not stepping into marriage as an equal. She was arriving with terms attached. Her worth, at least in part, had been measured, bargained over, and signed off with formal agreement. That she might long for affection or hope for kindness or dream of something more was irrelevant to the numbers inked on the parchment. She brought what her family could give, and from there, she would build her future. In the medieval world, young love rarely unfolded in secret. It unfolded under watchful eyes, in daylight, under the constant presence of family, neighbors, and clergy. To be a maiden was not just a phase of life, it was a public role, one scrutinized with quiet intensity. Every glance, every smile, every extended conversation with a boy could spark concern. Courtship was not something two people did alone. It was something that happened in the presence of a village, an entire community invested in the outcome. And in most cases, that community acted like an unpaid but ever vigilant network of chaperones. A girl might be accompanied to market by her mother or aunt. She might be sent to the well with younger siblings trailing behind. If a suitor showed interest, he could expect to be met with a chorus of casual interruptions, someone stepping between them, someone calling her name, someone watching from a window across the road. Families believed that a girl's reputation was fragile, like glass. One mark, one rumor, and it could be shattered beyond repair. And so her movements were tracked not just out of fear, but out of strategy. A clean record increased her value. A flirtation could lower her worth. Love, in this context, became a performance, and one that had to be carefully stage managed. Among the working classes, young people sometimes had a bit more room to breathe. They might steal moments while tending animals or helping with harvest, but even then, they were rarely out of sight for long. In towns, apprentices and maids might flirt behind taverns or in doorways after dark, but these encounters were risky. A wrong step could lead to gossip, punishment, or worse. In some communities, simply being caught walking with a boy at night could earn a girl a harsh lecture or a formal warning from the local priest. There were even laws in some towns requiring that young women be indoors by a certain hour, laws that served not only as curfews, but as public statements of control. For noble families, supervision was even more intense. Daughters of lords and knights were kept under strict guard. A romantic attachment that didn't serve the family's interest could unravel years of alliance building. Servants reported every word. Governesses monitored letters. If a noblewoman received a poem, it might be intercepted and read aloud to her father before she ever saw it. Even matches that seemed promising could be dismantled with a single disapproving nod. Love was never private. It was political. And the cost of following your heart was often exile, disgrace, or forced separation. Yet in spite of all this, affection found its way in. Lovers wrote in code. They passed messages in baskets of bread or under folded cloth. They arranged to meet at church or during festivals, using the noise and chaos to shield their exchanges. A glance across a crowded feast, a brush of the hand at the edge of the crowd, these were the quiet rebellions that fueled young love. Because even under constant watch, the heart still reached. To witness a noble wedding in medieval Europe was to witness theater, not of romance, but of power. The tapestries were hung, the feast prepared, the guests assembled in their finest robes. But beneath the color and ceremony, every step had been orchestrated months, even years in advance. These weddings were not declarations of love. They were declarations of intent. The bride and groom were not so much individuals as representatives of their lineages, their signatures, binding not only their own futures, but the fortunes of entire houses. A marriage between noble families was not the happy ending to a courtship. It was the opening move in a long and often brutal game. Negotiations began early. A girl might be promised before she reached adolescence, her name inscribed on documents she could not read. Fathers met with envoys. Monks were brought in to confirm bloodlines and ensure there was no breach of canon law. Property was discussed, inheritance calculated, and dowries debated in hushed voices over wine and wax seals. A noblewoman's body became a ledger of political worth, fertile enough to continue the line, obedient enough not to threaten the balance, and virtuous enough to avoid scandal. A nobleman's value was weighed in title, land, and the ability to defend them. Affection had no place at the table. When the day arrived, the bride might enter the church in a veil so thick she could barely see. She might be nervous or resolute, hopeful or resigned, but her feelings were secondary to the spectacle. Guests were watching. Clergy were recording. Witnesses stood ready to confirm that the union had been made with the right words, the right gestures, at the right hour. And if the couple barely knew one another, that was seen as ideal. Emotional attachment could complicate politics. It was better to forge alliances between strangers, strangers who would learn, over time, to live with what had been arranged. Once married, the couple's roles were sharply defined. A noblewoman was expected to run the household, bear children, and maintain her dignity. A nobleman was expected to protect his holdings and keep his wife in her place. Infidelity was common but heavily gendered. A husband's indiscretions were tolerated so long as they did not disgrace the family. A wife's were grounds for annulment or worse. If the marriage was unhappy, it was borne in silence. If it was violent, the wife might appeal to the church, but rarely with success. And if love did blossom between them, it was often in spite of the system, not because of it. Still, not all noble unions were joyless. There are letters, preserved in fragile ink, that speak of tenderness between aristocratic spouses. Some couples learned to trust each other. A few even came to love. But this was never the expectation. It was an accident of compatibility, a fortunate glitch in a design built not for hearts, but for dynasties. Once the vows were spoken and the feast cleared away, the couple was left with something far more complex than ceremony: each other. In a world where marriage had little to do with emotion, what happened after the wedding often came down to quiet, uncertain negotiation. How do two strangers, bound by politics or property, begin to live as husband and wife? How does desire take shape in a relationship arranged by others? In many cases, it didn't, not immediately. Affection was expected to grow over time, if it grew at all. In the meantime, duty filled the silence. He was to provide, protect, and be obeyed. She was to serve, bear children, and maintain the household's honor. Anything beyond that, closeness, trust, physical longing, was considered a blessing, but not a requirement. For some couples, intimacy was mechanical, a means to an end, a ritual for producing heirs and confirming legitimacy. These moments were expected, timed, and often observed in some form, whether through servants in the room or clerics demanding proof that the marriage had been consummated. The church taught that marital intimacy was acceptable, but only if it remained within strict bounds. No excessive pleasure, no unusual positions, no activity during forbidden times. It was, above all, supposed to be moderate. And so for many couples, especially those trying to remain devout, desire became something to restrain rather than explore. But desire, by its nature, resists restraint. Over time, some couples found themselves wanting more, not just from each other, but from the experience of being together. A brush of the hand during chores, a private laugh shared during a public event, a glance held longer than necessary across a room. These were not grand declarations, but small steps towards something human. And in a world shaped by duty, even these small steps felt daring. Sometimes affection grew quietly between people who had expected nothing from each other. Sometimes it flared briefly, only to be extinguished by fear, guilt, or external judgment. But always it had to fight for space within the marriage contract. Among the lower classes, desire was often shaped by exhaustion and necessity. Long days of labor, cramped sleeping quarters, and the constant presence of children made privacy nearly impossible. And yet, couples still managed. They found ways to share intimacy under shared blankets, behind cloth partitions, or in brief moments snatched during early mornings or late nights. These acts were not grand or romantic, but they were real. They were acts of survival, of both the relationship and the self. And for those who felt desire, but found no outlet within their marriage, the consequences could be severe. Adultery was dangerous. Dissatisfaction, even unspoken, could grow corrosive. But there were also moments of grace, unplanned touches, lingering warmth, or the surprising gentleness of a partner once thought cold. These quiet sparks of desire, when they came, were rarely spoken of aloud. But for those who experienced them, they became a kind of secret light in the long, dark corridors of obligation. In stories, love begins under moonlight, with stolen glances, whispered promises, and hands that find each other in the dark. But in the medieval world, moonlight often meant risk. A late-night meeting was not a romantic flourish. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a dangerous gamble in a society where unsanctioned affection could ruin lives. For those who dared to pursue love outside the rigid channels of arranged marriages and public supervision, secrecy was not an option. It was a necessity. The moon did not cast its glow on romance. It cast suspicion. And everyone who crept out after dusk knew that love, if it came at all, would come with consequences. Unmarried couples who desired one another had to navigate a minefield. Courtship was allowed only within limits, and physical contact was watched closely. If a young man visited a girl too often or stayed too long at her family's door, questions were asked. If a girl was seen alone at night, even for innocent reasons, gossip could begin to swirl. Sometimes these suspicions led to nothing, but sometimes they led to formal inquiries. A local priest might confront the couple. Neighbors might testify. A reputation, especially for a young woman, could be lost with a single whisper. And once gone, it rarely returned. Still, despite the risks, moonlight meetings happened. Lovers arranged rendezvous in barns, by riverbanks, along forest paths. They timed their steps with the silence of the village, slipping from their homes after the candles were extinguished and returning before the first light touched the sky. Every kiss, every word, carried the thrill of danger. For some, it was the only way to be with the person they truly loved, especially if their families had promised them to someone else. For others, it was a brief escape from the narrow roles they'd been forced to play. In either case, it required careful planning, constant vigilance, and an understanding that discovery could mean disgrace or forced separation. Elopements occurred, but rarely ended well. Couples who fled together without permission might find themselves excommunicated, disinherited, or hunted down and forcibly returned. Some parishes required public penance for such acts, standing barefoot before the church, confessing the sin of desire. In a few cases, the elopement might be retroactively accepted if the families could be persuaded to recognize the union. But this was the exception, not the rule. More often, moonlight love stories ended in separation, silence, or marriage to someone chosen by others. Yet even amid this atmosphere of mistrust, longing found its way forward. Love letters, often dictated to sympathetic friends or disguised as prayers, were passed in secret. Small gifts, tokens of affection, were exchanged under the cover of chores or church. Songs were sung with layered meanings, their lyrics hinting at feelings too dangerous to name outright. The moonlight, despite its risks, offered a sliver of freedom, a quiet space outside the reach of daily scrutiny. And for those who braved it, even a moment of connection could be worth everything. There are few rituals in medieval life more intrusive, more humiliating, or more steeped in contradiction than the inspection of a bride's virginity. It was not always required, and it was not always formal. But when it happened, it was an act that turned the most intimate aspects of a woman's life into a matter of public concern. Her worth, her family's honor, and the validity of her marriage could all hinge on a single moment, a single observation, or the supposed evidence of a stained sheet. In a culture where purity was currency, the burden fell almost entirely on the bride to prove something that could neither be reliably measured nor honestly enforced. And it began before the wedding night even arrived. In some cases, especially among the nobility, a girl's virginity was a matter of political significance. If a powerful alliance depended on her marriage, the stakes were enormous. Rumors of impropriety could unravel months of negotiation. Midwives or older female relatives might be called upon to examine her before the ceremony, quietly, privately, and with a kind of resigned cruelty passed down through generations. These women were not medical professionals in the modern sense. They relied on folk knowledge, superstition, and observation. They checked for supposed physical markers, asked pointed questions, and sometimes made judgments based on little more than demeanor or hearsay. Their word could elevate or destroy a girl's future. After the wedding, the pressure intensified. The consummation of the marriage wasn't just assumed, it had to be proven. In some traditions, the bed sheets were inspected the next morning for blood. The linens were sometimes paraded before family or servants, displayed like trophies to confirm the bride's virtue and the husband's virility. Failure to produce this proof could lead to disputes, annulments, or years of bitter gossip. It didn't matter that the hymen, often misunderstood, did not always break during intercourse, or that the presence or absence of blood said nothing about character. What mattered was the appearance of proof, the illusion of certainty, the performance of chastity. For many women, this moment was terrifying. It was not about love or trust or tenderness. It was about scrutiny, about being judged for something they might not even understand. Young brides, some barely past puberty, were thrust into this trial with no preparation. Their husbands might be strangers. The experience might be painful. And still, they knew they would be judged, perhaps not by their husband, but by the servants, the midwives, the in-laws waiting outside. One false step, one whisper, and they could be marked forever. And yet, many endured it. Some found ways to fake the evidence, smuggling in animal blood, cutting fingers, pre-staining the sheets. Others were lucky enough to have husbands who ignored the ritual, who offered compassion instead of inspection. But for every girl spared, another was condemned not by her actions, but by her biology and the weight of expectation. In the end, it was never about purity. It was about control, about turning a private threshold into a public verdict. Marriage in medieval Europe did not end with the exchange of vows. It only began. The true confirmation came later, in the bedroom, under a gaze that was never entirely private. In many communities, noble and common alike, there existed a tradition both theatrical and invasive, the bedding ceremony. It was not just symbolic, it was communal. A newlywed couple's first night together was not theirs alone. It was witnessed, encouraged, and sometimes directly participated in by those around them. Friends, family, and servants all played a role, guiding the bride and groom to the bed as if intimacy were a performance to be completed before an audience. In noble households, the ceremony could be elaborate. Guests would walk the couple to their chambers, often with music or bawdy jokes. The bride's gown might be removed by her ladies-in-waiting, the groom's tunic taken by his companions. They would be tucked into bed together, often under the eyes of important witnesses who were there to ensure the marriage was not only lawful, but physically consummated. The couple was expected to at least lie beside each other until the door closed. In some cases, the guests remained long enough to hear the first movements of union. In the most extreme accounts, attendants stayed in the room until the act was finished, their silence promised but not always kept. This tradition did not exist everywhere, and it was not always enforced. But where it did, it reduced the most personal moment of a couple's life to a kind of ritualized surveillance. The bride, often young and uncertain, might have no say in what happened. The groom, pressured by expectations of virility and honor, could be as anxious as he was entitled. The bedding ceremony blurred the lines between celebration and violation. It gave the community license to participate in the couple's private life under the guise of protecting tradition, and once done, it left behind a trail of whispers, laughter, or disapproval, none of which the couple could escape. Among peasants, the practice was often more informal, but still deeply rooted in custom. Friends might carry the couple to bed, shout ribald encouragements through the walls, or leave behind symbolic gifts, a jug of ale, a loaf of bread, a fertility charm made from herbs. In tight-knit villages, these gestures were meant to bind the community together, but they also served as a form of control. Everyone knew who had been touched, who had been watched, and who had followed the rules. And if the couple refused to participate, it could raise suspicion. What did they have to hide? For some, the ceremony passed quickly, forgotten amid wine and nerves. For others, it became a source of lasting discomfort, something they never wished to speak of again. It was yet another reminder that in this world, even love belonged to the crowd, that desire, trust, and vulnerability were not yours to explore alone. They had to be performed, inspected, and verified. To be born a daughter in medieval Europe meant growing up with a future already shaped by others. From the moment she could walk, her value was assessed not by what she desired, but by what she could offer, namely alliance, labor, and lineage. Among noble families, this often meant betrothal at a very young age. Formal marriage could come by 12, sometimes earlier in arrangement, though cohabitation might be delayed until the girl was older. But even then, the expectations placed upon her were real and weighty. She was no longer simply a child. She was now part of a plan, a link in a chain of generational strategy. The arrangement of these unions was rarely about affection. It was about politics, property, or avoiding conflict. A noble daughter might be promised to a distant house to secure a truce, reinforce a land claim, or repay a favor. In many cases, she met her husband for the first time on her wedding day, a stranger she was expected to obey, honor, and eventually raise children with. The church permitted marriages as early as 12 for girls, provided there was consent, but the line between consent and compliance was often blurred. What mattered most was the agreement of fathers, the transfer of dowry, and the continuity of inheritance. In rural communities, the pressures were more practical than political. Families needed hands to help with work, and marriages often served as a way to combine resources. Girls might be promised to neighbors, shepherds, or apprentices with steady skills. While many peasant weddings occurred in the late teens or early 20s, it was still common for promises to be made years earlier. A daughter's future could be sealed long before she understood what marriage meant. Her role was to accept the decision, adjust to her new life, and fulfill her duties in whatever household she joined. The emotional side of these experiences is harder to trace. Most records come from legal documents, not personal diaries. But from what does survive, in the form of letters, oral traditions, and rare glimpses of first-hand accounts, it's clear that not every girl accepted her fate without question. Some were fearful, others were resilient, a few resisted, but many, in the end, did what was expected, learning to navigate adulthood before they'd had time to finish childhood. They entered unfamiliar homes, bore unfamiliar names, and adapted to lives they had not chosen. The legacy of these early marriages is not one of romance, but of endurance. These girls were not only wives, they were workers, caretakers, and often mothers while still in their teens. They grew up quickly because they had to, because their communities saw them not as individuals to protect, but as pieces in a wider system of survival. In the medieval world, pregnancy was more than a biological reality. It was a social, moral, and even spiritual statement. A swelling belly marked not just a change in the body, but a shift in how a woman was viewed, judged, and handled by those around her. If she was married, Pregnancy was seen as a fulfillment of duty, a blessing, proof that the union had taken root. If she was not, it became a scandal, a source of shame, and a subject for intervention, especially from the church. For better or worse, a woman's pregnancy was rarely her own. It belonged to her family, her neighbors, her midwife, and very often, her priest. The church held a powerful grip on the meaning of pregnancy. A married woman who conceived was expected to remain modest, obedient, and prayerful. Her condition was seen as a sacred burden. She might be excused from fasting, offered blessings, or asked to dedicate her unborn child to the Virgin Mary. But she was also watched closely. Excessive emotion, cravings, or complaints could be interpreted as signs of spiritual weakness. If she struggled during labor, some believed it was punishment for sin, often citing the biblical curse placed on Eve. In this way, the pain of childbirth was not just physical, it was moralized. A woman was taught to suffer quietly and to see her suffering as redemptive. For unmarried women, however, the same condition invited suspicion and condemnation. An unmarried pregnancy prompted questions. Who was the father? How had this happened? And what sin had brought it about? If a woman denied wrongdoing, claiming innocence or confusion, she might be interrogated. In some cases, especially if the child's paternity had social or legal implications, she would be brought before a priest or court to give a formal account. These proceedings could be grueling. Some were forced to name the father under pressure. Others were accused of falsehood or seduction. The community would often form its judgment long before any formal investigation ended. Midwives played a crucial role in both cases. They were the first to detect signs of pregnancy, the ones who guided the mother through each stage, and the ones who delivered the child. But they were also informants, especially in towns where the church kept close watch. A midwife who failed to report an unwed pregnancy risked censure herself. In some regions, they were required to keep records, attend church inquiries, or even give testimony. Their loyalty was divided between the women they served and the authorities who demanded answers. Despite all this, life continued. Married women bore children while tending fires and managing homes. Unmarried women, if supported by family or protected by secrecy, sometimes raised their children quietly, hiding the truth or inventing stories to preserve what little dignity they had. Others were not so lucky. Some were sent away, some were punished, some lost their children. But in all cases, the act of bringing life into the world was tangled with scrutiny and spiritual oversight. It was never simple. To become a mother in medieval Europe was to step into a world of constant responsibility, physical exhaustion, and often emotional solitude. It was not the idealized image of warm hearths and smiling children so often painted in modern memory. It was a relentless, consuming task that defined nearly every moment of a woman's life after childbirth. From the outside, motherhood was celebrated, praised as a woman's highest calling, proof of her virtue and usefulness. But behind closed doors, far from public prayers and festival blessings, the reality of raising children in a fragile, uncertain world was stark, isolating, and frequently overwhelming. For most mothers, especially those in the working classes, there was no pause after birth. Within days, sometimes hours, they were expected to return to chores, tending fields, baking bread, or hauling water with a newborn tied to their side, or left under the care of an older child barely out of infancy herself. There was no maternity leave, no break to recover. The family needed food, the fire needed stoking, the cows needed milking. A woman might be praised for being fruitful, but she was still expected to be functional. The physical toll was immense. Many women gave birth year after year, their bodies worn down by constant pregnancies, difficult labors, and the unending demands of small children. Beyond the physical strain, there was the emotional burden, particularly in the earliest years of a child's life, when illness loomed large and death was common. A mother might bury 2 or 3 children before one reached adulthood. Fevers, infections, accidents, or poor nutrition could take a baby in a matter of days. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no assurance that love and care would be enough. And so, while the community might celebrate each new birth, the mother often held her joy close, guarded by a fear she could not shake. Every cough, every cry in the night, every sign of weakness stirred a quiet dread. Would this one survive? Socially, motherhood also meant a narrowing of the world. A young woman who once walked freely in fields or visited neighbors during market days now found her life revolving around the home. Travel became rare. Leisure nearly vanished. Friendships faded under the weight of diapers, illness, and exhaustion. If she was lucky, she had help, her own mother, a sister, or older daughters to share the load. But even then, the expectation remained that she carry it with grace, without complaint. To speak of weariness was to risk being seen as ungrateful or unholy. Even among the nobility, where servants might assist with childcare, motherhood was no less demanding. Noble women were expected to oversee the upbringing of heirs, maintain propriety, and still fulfill courtly duties. Their isolation was different, less physical, more emotional. They were surrounded by people, yet still alone in the private doubts and fears that came with every child's cry. In all classes, motherhood was seen as sacred, but rarely as tender. It was revered from a distance, but lived in the shadows. In medieval Europe, the womb was not just a part of the body. It was a site of theological concern, political control, and moral weight. The church had opinions on nearly every aspect of womanhood, but none more so than reproduction. From the moment a woman was capable of bearing children, her body was seen as a vessel for divine or sinful consequence. The church taught that motherhood was a sacred duty, a direct fulfillment of God's command to be fruitful and multiply. But that same institution wrapped reproduction in shame, contradiction, and fear, turning the most natural elements of life into something that had to be watched, judged, and regulated. Women were taught that their bodies were inherently flawed, descendants of Eve, who had brought sin into the world. Menstruation was seen not just as physical cleansing, but as a reminder of that fall from grace. Midwives were instructed to pray over women in labor, not just to ease their pain, but to protect the child's soul in case it died before baptism. There was constant anxiety about the fate of infants who died unbaptized. Would they enter heaven? Purgatory? Some believed they were doomed to limbo, a sorrowful place without suffering, but also without hope. Mothers who lost their babies carried that weight not just emotionally, but spiritually, believing their own sinfulness might have played a role. The church's concern extended far beyond theology. It attempted to shape behavior, how often couples could be intimate, when conception was acceptable, and what kinds of desire were tolerable. There were entire seasons when marital sex was forbidden, during Lent, on holy days, or even on certain days of the week. A woman who became pregnant during such times might fear she had offended God. Midwives and confessors were trained to ask about timing, intention, and technique. The womb was not private. It was policed, quietly but thoroughly. Abortion and miscarriage were treated with suspicion. Any woman who lost a child too early, especially without witnesses or help, might face questioning. Was it an accident, a punishment, or something more deliberate? Women accused of trying to end a pregnancy could be brought before ecclesiastical courts. Even if innocent, they might carry the stain of rumor for years. Remedies used to treat pain or regulate menstruation were sometimes banned for being too similar to abortifacients. And yet, in whispered conversations between women, herbs and knowledge passed from hand to hand. Quiet wisdom that lived outside the church's reach, taught by grandmothers, not priests. Despite all this, many women found ways to claim agency within these limits. They prayed for healthy births. They negotiated with their husbands to space pregnancies. They confided in midwives, relied on sisterhood, and made peace with the contradictions handed down from pulpits and pulpits alone. The church claimed the womb belonged to God, but the experience of carrying life, of losing it, of bringing it into the world, remained deeply personal, something no doctrine could fully contain. Loss in the medieval world was woven into daily life, but when it came to the death of a child, especially an unborn or newborn one, it was a grief that many women carried in silence. There were no graves for miscarried babies, no public mourning rituals for stillbirths, no shared language for the kind of sorrow that unfolded behind closed doors. A woman who lost a child was expected to recover, resume her duties, and try again. The rhythms of life did not stop for her grief. If anything, the world around her seemed designed to ignore it. And so, while the death of a knight might be immortalized in song, the death of an infant barely merited a whisper. Miscarriages were common and not always survivable. Without modern medicine, the risks were immense. Malnutrition, overwork, and infection could cause a pregnancy to fail at any stage. Yet when it happened, the blame often fell on the mother. Had she eaten something forbidden? Had she moved too quickly, lifted too much, thought impure thoughts? The church, while offering prayers, also offered guilt. Clergy might imply that a woman's inner sin had somehow brought misfortune upon the child. Even other women, bound by the same culture of shame, might distance themselves in fear or judgment. In this way, grief became not just private, but isolating. If the child had been baptized, a burial might be allowed. But for the many who died in the womb or during delivery, there were few formal rites. In some regions, women created their own customs, planting herbs, whispering prayers, leaving small offerings at the edge of sacred woods or under icons in a chapel. These acts were not sanctioned, but they were deeply human. A quiet protest against forgetting. A way to say, this mattered, even if no one else would say it. For women who experienced repeated loss, the toll was unimaginable. Imagine being pregnant 5, 6, even 10 times, only to bury child after child, all while being told that motherhood was your highest purpose. Imagine the silence that followed each birth that ended too soon, and the weight of trying to smile and serve bread to guests the very next day. Some women hardened, others grew quiet, a few broke completely. But their stories are mostly lost because they were not written down. They were not considered history. They were simply absorbed by time. And yet, there were signs of shared sorrow. In the margins of manuscripts, tiny prayers were scrawled, sometimes in a woman's hand, asking for protection in childbirth, or forgiveness for a child gone before its time. In folk songs, laments were sung that hinted at lives lost too early. These were the fragments of grief, stitched into the fabric of medieval life, not by decree, but by survival. In a world that had little space for female sorrow, women still found ways to grieve. Quietly, persistently, together even if no one saw them. In medieval Europe, the act of nursing was never just a matter of nature. It was wrapped in class, economy, and quiet negotiation. Breastfeeding connected a mother to her child in the most elemental way. But in a world where birth was constant and survival never guaranteed, not every mother nursed her own. Some could not, others were forbidden, and for a particular group of women, usually from the lower classes, breastfeeding became a job, a transaction, and a livelihood. These were the wet nurses. Their labor was not the kind praised in church sermons or romantic tales, yet it sustained entire lineages, noble houses, and vulnerable infants whose survival depended on borrowed bodies. Among the elite, hiring a wet nurse was common. Noble women, especially those involved in court life or expected to bear multiple children in succession, were discouraged from nursing their own babies. The belief was partly medical and partly social. Nursing was thought to weaken fertility, and noble families could not afford long gaps between heirs. It was also considered too time-consuming, too intimate, too bodily for women whose lives were meant to be wrapped in fabric, etiquette, and duty. And so, a servant was summoned, usually a woman who had recently given birth herself, whose own infant might be passed off to a neighbor or fed with thin gruel so that the more valuable child, the noble one, could thrive on her milk. These arrangements were both practical and painful. For the wet nurse, the wages could mean survival, coin for food, protection, maybe a better home. But it also meant separation from her own family and the emotional strain of nurturing a child who was not hers, often while her own child received little or nothing. Some wet nurses formed strong bonds with the babies they fed and were allowed to remain in the household as long-term caretakers. Others were dismissed as soon as the child was weaned, their service acknowledged with nothing more than a pouch of coins and a blessing. The system had no space for sentiment. It was about nourishment, efficiency, and hierarchy. Among the poor, wet nursing was less structured but still present. If a mother died in childbirth or was too malnourished or ill to produce milk, another village woman might step in. Sometimes it was a sister, sometimes a neighbor. In tight-knit communities, milk sharing was an act of survival, often done without formal payment, but with deep bonds formed between households. These women were not praised in records. Their names did not appear in family trees, but they saved lives. Quietly, constantly. Still, even this sacred task could be twisted by rumor and distrust. Some believed a child nursed by the wrong woman could inherit her temperament, her sins, even her station. A wet nurse of bad character was feared, as if her milk might taint not just the body, but the soul. It was one more way a woman's body was seen as powerful, dangerous, and never entirely her own. In a world where medicine was a patchwork of prayer, superstition, and hands-on experience, midwives held a quiet dominion. They were not priests. They were not physicians. And yet, in the moments that mattered most, when life entered, when life teetered, or when it slipped away, it was the midwife who was summoned. She arrived with cloths, herbs, sharp eyes, and calloused hands. She knew how to measure a pulse with her fingertips, how to shift a crying body into position, and how to coax breath into a newborn's lungs using warmth and whispered names. She operated outside official structures, but inside every home that needed her. And because she dealt in blood, breath, and birth, she was both revered and feared. The church recognized midwives, grudgingly. They were permitted to perform emergency baptisms if an infant was likely to die before reaching a priest. This alone gave them a kind of spiritual authority that most lay people never touched, but it also made them targets. Any woman who held that kind of power outside the church's walls invited scrutiny. Was she faithful? Did she pray before delivering a child? Did she dabble in herbs that might prevent conception, ease pain, or hasten a birth? Midwives walked a delicate line. Too skilled, and they might be accused of sorcery. Too bold, and they might be punished. But too cautious, and they failed the women who needed them most. Their knowledge came from apprenticeship and lived experience passed down through generations. Most could not read, but they memorized mixtures of mugwort, rue, and fennel. They could feel the shift of a baby turning too late, recognize the subtle signs of fever, and comfort a laboring mother with songs sung by countless women before. Their tools were simple: linen, oil, bone scissors. But their presence was anything but. When a midwife entered a room, she brought with her the weight of centuries of female knowledge. Knowledge often dismissed by scholars, but never by the women who bled and bore in silence. Midwives served all classes. In the cities, they might be attached to parishes, called upon for every birth in the quarter. In the countryside, they were sometimes the only medical aid a village had. They knew not just how to deliver a child, but how to care for a mother after, how to stop a hemorrhage with pressure and cold, how to sit with a woman through stillness, death, and the haunting quiet that followed a life that never began. They were the first to hear the first cry, and the last to close a woman's eyes when childbirth went wrong. Yet despite this indispensable role, their names rarely appear in history. They were not seen as healers or saints. They were ordinary women doing extraordinary things in kitchens and bedchambers, behind curtains and closed doors. And they did it without applause, without parchment, without monuments. Just stories, passed from mother to daughter, whispered in the dark. Desire in medieval Europe did not vanish behind stone walls or beneath woolen gowns. It lived in glances held too long, in hands brushing briefly at market stalls, in whispered jokes behind tavern doors. But outside the boundaries of marriage, touch became something dangerous, both desired and feared. For many, the human need for closeness was shaped not by freedom, but by limits. Chastity was praised, temptation condemned, and yet the yearning didn't vanish. It simply went underground. Beneath the sermons, beneath the rules, longing persisted, and in the lives of countless men and women, it played out quietly, in daydreams, in secrets, in the shadowy corners of daily life. For young people especially, the tension was unbearable. Courtship was strictly monitored. Meetings were chaperoned, letters passed through family members or trusted friends. But even under watchful eyes, feelings bloomed. A girl might pretend to fetch water just to see the apprentice who smiled at her last week. A boy might find excuses to linger near the baker's daughter, hoping for a word, a smile, a moment. Physical boundaries were clear, but emotional ones, those were harder to control. Love poems circulated behind cloister walls. Carvings of lovers embracing appeared in church margins. It was as if the world couldn't help but confess, even while it punished the confession. When moments of physical closeness happened, they were rare and fleeting. A dance at a village feast, a stumble that led to an accidental touch, a stolen kiss behind a stable wall. These small acts carried enormous weight. They could lead to gossip, punishment, or worse. But they also offered something harder to name, a reminder that the body could still feel, that in a world obsessed with denial, warmth still had meaning. For women in particular, touch was carefully policed. Her virtue defined her worth. A rumor, even untrue, could ruin her. So she learned to hide affection behind politeness, curiosity behind silence. But inside, she felt it all the same. For those already married, longing could take on a different form, especially if the match had been arranged without affection. A wife might feel nothing for her husband but obligation. A husband might find himself aching for tenderness in a home filled with duty, and yet society offered little space for honest desire, especially the kind that did not fit into neat roles. Intimacy was expected to serve a purpose: reproduction, reputation, obedience. Anything beyond that, emotional connection, mutual yearning, was a luxury many never tasted. Still, people found ways to feel. They touched through shared songs, laughter, secret tokens left beneath blankets or windowsills. A ribbon, a carved spoon, a pressed flower. In a world where so much was forbidden, even the smallest acts became sacred. These quiet moments, glimpses of something warmer, freer, reminded them that life was not just about survival. It was also about the longing to be known. There was a silence particular to the inside of a medieval church, the kind that hummed with echoes, the kind that held secrets. And for many, the most vulnerable secret they would ever speak came inside the dim shadow of a confessional. These were not the ornate wooden booths of modern imagination, but simple corners behind stone pillars, curtained alcoves, or seats near the altar where a priest would sit and listen. It was here, kneeling on cold floors, that people confessed their fears, desires, and sins. And among the most carefully whispered were those of the body, those tangled in touch, in thoughts, in longing. The church taught that sins of the flesh were not just physical lapses. They were signs of spiritual failure, proof that the soul had strayed. Lust was not just weakness, it was a crack in one's armor against evil. And so people confessed. They confessed to premarital encounters, to thoughts that would not leave them, to dreams they could not control. They confessed to touching when they had promised not to wanting what they had been told was forbidden. Confession became a strange act of relief and judgment all at once. To speak the truth brought a kind of freedom, but it also marked the penitent, sometimes forever. For priests, confession was meant to be a sacred duty. They were listeners, not judges, at least in theory. But the reality was more complicated. Some priests offered compassion, guiding their flock with gentle words, urging repentance without humiliation. Others were far less kind. Power could twist their role. A young woman might confess something personal, an indiscretion, a desire, and find herself the subject of scrutiny, gossip, or worse. In some cases, confession became a tool of control, used to shame or manipulate. The line between spiritual guidance and moral surveillance was thin and often crossed. Despite the risk, people kept coming. Because in a world where the church shaped every facet of daily life, confession was one of the only spaces where honesty was permitted, if only briefly. It was also one of the only places a woman might speak openly about what had happened to her, if she had been coerced, abandoned, or burdened with guilt that was not hers to carry. She might not find justice, but she might find someone to hear her. Someone who, even silently, acknowledged her pain. The rituals of confession were meant to purify, but they also served another purpose. They reminded the community that perfection was impossible. Everyone faltered, everyone longed, everyone carried shame that grew too heavy to bear alone. And so they came, again and again, to murmur the truth into the dark, to hope for mercy, to begin again. Among the more enduring images of medieval sexuality is that of the chastity belt, a cruel iron contraption locked around a woman's waist to preserve her virtue in her husband's absence. It's a story repeated in books, whispered in documentaries, and imagined in countless tales about jealous lords and faithful wives. But like so many symbols from the past, the truth is far more tangled. The chastity belt, as commonly imagined, is less a historical reality and more a reflection of obsession with purity, with control, with the idea that a woman's body could be guarded like a castle and sealed like a treasure chest. Physical chastity belts did exist, though not in the numbers often claimed. Most real examples date from the Renaissance or later, and many were never intended for actual use. Some were theatrical, others ceremonial, and a few were likely cruel curiosities or jokes presented in courts obsessed with spectacle. The idea of locking a woman into submission was powerful, but more often than not, the locking happened through culture, not steel. The true chastity belt was made not of iron, but of fear, sermons, and scrutiny. Girls were told from childhood that their worth began and ended with their modesty. Their purity was their dowry. Their silence was their shield. Control came in layers. Social expectations dictated where a woman could go, who she could speak to, how she dressed, how she sat. Families took on the role of guardians, monitoring behavior, shaming deviation. The church reinforced this through constant reminders that female desire was dangerous, that temptation lurked in beauty, and that the body must be reined in like a wild animal. A woman who strayed, or was even thought to, was said to bring ruin upon her house. And so, the chastity belt became less a literal device and more a metaphor for a life lived under inspection. There were real consequences. A girl who was rumored to have been touched might find her marriage prospects vanish. A widow who chose a lover might lose her inheritance. A wife who was suspected of infidelity, whether true or not, could be cast out or worse. The laws were not always enforced, but they were known. They lingered like shadows in conversation, shaping what women could do with their own skin. And while men were not held to the same rigid standards, they often acted as the enforcers of them, believing they had a right not only to loyalty, but to access. Still, women were never entirely passive. They resisted in small, clever ways. They forged friendships that allowed them moments of freedom. They exchanged secrets and warnings. Some found ways to meet lovers in private, disguising their meetings as pilgrimages or visits to kin. Others endured, surviving in silence but refusing to break. And some simply disappeared from record altogether, stepping outside the world that wanted to lock them down. Behind the stone walls of medieval convents, far from the bustling markets and marriage halls, lived women who had taken vows of chastity, silence, and obedience. These were the nuns, brides of Christ, as they were often called. To many, they represented the ultimate form of spiritual purity, women who had renounced the world and its pleasures to serve God alone. But even in these cloistered spaces, desire found ways to breathe. Not always physical, not always spoken, but real, persistent, and human. Because entering a convent did not mean leaving behind the body. It simply meant learning to live with its echoes in a place where they were not supposed to exist. Some women chose the veil willingly, driven by faith, a yearning for quiet, or a desire to escape the dangers of marriage and childbirth. But many were sent, daughters who were too numerous, too costly to marry off, or inconvenient to family strategy, often found themselves pledged to the church. Some entered at age 12 or younger, not fully understanding what the vows would mean. They arrived in silent processions, heads bowed, futures sealed. And once inside, they were expected to transform into obedient sisters who would pray, labor, and live without questioning the rules that now governed their every move. But the body does not forget itself. Feelings stirred in quiet corridors. Friendship deepened into longing. Dreams brought confusion. And in some cases, love bloomed between nuns, between novices and confessors, even across the boundaries of cloister walls. These relationships were rarely acknowledged. When discovered, they were condemned as sinful, disruptive, and dangerous. Yet they happened. They were real. They spoke to the simple truth that no vow could completely erase, that the human heart reaches for connection, even in the most sacred places. Records from the period tell of scandals, of letters intercepted, of midnight meetings, of severe punishments handed down to those caught in acts of affection. But they also reveal something more poignant. Some nuns wrote poetry, hidden in the margins of prayer books, describing longing not just for divine love, but for the warmth of another soul. Some asked saints for guidance, not to rid themselves of desire, but to understand it. Others simply bore the weight in silence, offering it up as a kind of spiritual penance. Life in the convent was not all repression. It could also be a space of learning, leadership, and sisterhood. Nuns managed land, copied manuscripts, and served as midwives and healers. For some, the community of women became a refuge, a rare place where female voices carried weight. But this power was always under scrutiny, always held on a leash. If the convents grew too independent, if the nuns too vocal, reformers intervened, reminding them that obedience was their highest virtue. Desire did not vanish in the cloister. It adapted. It whispered instead of shouted. It passed through glances and gestures, through hymns and tears. Because even in sacred walls, the soul remained tethered to the flesh. Pilgrimage in the medieval world was a sacred act. To leave home and journey toward a holy site was to seek healing, forgiveness, or divine insight. Pilgrims walked to the shrines of saints, to relics rumored to cure disease or cleanse the soul. And for many, it was their first true escape from the rigid rhythms of village life. But the road to salvation was never as simple as it seemed. Beneath the prayers and processions lay another layer of experience, one the church rarely acknowledged. The open road, far from watchful eyes, offered not just spiritual freedom, but physical liberation. And for some, it became a space where desire was given room to breathe. Men and women traveled together, often in mixed groups. They slept in crowded hostels, shared meals in unfamiliar inns, and passed long days on foot or horseback. The journey itself blurred boundaries of class, of propriety, of behavior. A noble woman walking in dust beside a poor baker's apprentice could find herself laughing, talking, even flirting in ways unthinkable at home. The anonymity of travel made people bolder. Pilgrims were strangers to one another, unburdened by local reputation. A glance held too long, a hand offered in jest, could open a door that had long been closed by duty and expectation. The church warned against such mingling. Moralists wrote sermons about the dangers of pilgrimage, how holy intent could be corrupted by carnal impulse. There were rules, of course. Pilgrims were to remain chaste, devout, humble. But enforcement was nearly impossible on the open road. And so, tales emerged of trysts in stables, of fleeting romances sparked beneath the stars, of lovers meeting again at the shrine only to part at the city gate. Some of these stories were cautionary. Others were quietly wistful, almost envious, because everyone knew, outside the walls of home, people changed. For women especially, pilgrimage could offer a rare taste of agency. A widow might take to the road alone, her veil replaced with a hood, her pace her own. A girl promised to a man she did not love might linger in the company of someone who made her laugh. While few dared to defy their fate entirely, the journey let them imagine other lives, ones in which they were not only daughters, wives, or nuns, but travelers, thinkers, lovers. These moments did not always end in scandal. Often they ended in silence. A memory carried home, folded like a ribbon beneath layers of wool. There were, of course, risks: theft, illness, assault. But there was also a strange kind of fellowship. Songs were shared, wounds were tended, prayers were whispered in foreign chapels where no one knew your name. And in that space, the lines between body and spirit blurred. Lust and longing walked beside faith and fatigue, forming a pilgrimage not just toward a relic, but toward understanding something deeply human, that the road itself changes you. At the heart of every medieval town was a market, a place of noise, trade, and necessity. Carts creaked over cobblestones, voices shouted prices, and smells of bread, sweat, and smoke filled the air. But just beyond the stalls of fishmongers and fabric sellers, another market existed, one not always acknowledged in daylight. It was the market of flesh. In certain alleys, behind taverns, near the edges of city walls, women sold not goods, but themselves. And though the church condemned them, and the law pretended to control them, the truth was simpler and sadder. Medieval cities could not function without them. Prostitution was at once reviled and tolerated. Officials passed laws to regulate it, often placing brothels in designated quarters, outside the city gates, near docks, or by rivers. These spaces were both visible and invisible, spoken of with disdain, yet visited frequently. They were peopled by women of all kinds, some who had no other choice, others who had been abandoned or widowed, a few who sought the work as a last act of independence. Many were young, most were poor, and all of them knew the unspoken rules, how to smile without promise, how to measure risk behind a coin. The church labeled these women sinful but necessary. Better, they argued, to contain male desire in such spaces than risk disorder elsewhere. The logic was brutal, but revealing. It showed how deeply the medieval world feared uncontrolled sexuality and how willing it was to sacrifice certain women to keep that fear managed. In sermons, prostitutes were likened to disease, rot, temptation. Yet in practice, they were taxed, monitored, even protected, so long as they stayed in their place. Step outside the brothel, disrupt the illusion of separation, and punishment came swiftly. But within those walls, humanity persisted. Women formed tight bonds, shared food, secrets, protection. They looked after one another's children, tended to each other's wounds, and created small rituals to survive. A ribbon tied around a wrist, a prayer said before sleep. They were not simply victims. They were survivors in a world stacked against them. And many, remarkably, kept their wit, their stories, their names. Some cities employed madams to manage the houses. Others allowed the women themselves to govern their own rooms. And though abuse was common and escape rare, these spaces also became strange sanctuaries, one of the only places where poor women could earn coin in their own right, even if it came at a terrible cost. Outside, they were judged. Inside, they negotiated. Visitors came from every walk of life: merchants, clergy, knights, apprentices. Desire, it turned out, did not obey class or vow. And when these men left, they returned to wives, to sermons, to silence, while the women remained, carrying stories no one asked to hear. It was a brutal exchange, but it was also one of the only economies in which a woman's body, unwanted elsewhere, was treated as currency. It says something painful about the world that for many, this was their best chance at survival. In medieval Europe, love could be a crime. Not always and not everywhere, but in moments where affection defied authority, when desire crossed boundaries of class, marriage, or obedience, it was enough to summon the courts. These were not trials for theft or violence, but for intimacy, for who touched whom and when, for letters exchanged in secret, for kisses stolen in shadow. And though the charges were cloaked in language about morality and sin, the truth was plainer. The heart had stepped out of line, and someone wanted it punished. Ecclesiastical courts handled many of these cases. Unlike secular courts, they focused not on broken laws, but broken commandments, on sins that threatened the moral order. A young couple caught embracing without betrothal might be summoned to explain themselves. A married man's affair with a servant could lead to penance, fines, or forced separation. A widow rumored to have taken a lover might face public shame, even if her actions harmed no one. The goal was not justice in any modern sense. It was containment. The church feared what love might do if left unchecked. Love disrupted arrangements, whispered rebellion, and refused to stay silent. The evidence brought to these trials was often flimsy: hearsay, innuendo, suspicion. A neighbor claimed she saw something through a window. A servant overheard a conversation. A mother accused her daughter of disobedience after finding a token under her pillow. Yet even this was enough to warrant a summons. Defendants were questioned sternly, asked to swear oaths, sometimes subjected to humiliating examinations. And while the punishments varied, public confession, temporary excommunication, beatings, they always left a mark. To be tried for love was to be made a spectacle, a lesson for others. But the trials also reveal something else: how desperately people wanted to love, even when the world forbade it. Young men risked everything to court women deemed beneath or above their station. Girls wrote verses into corners of prayer books, tucking them beneath lace sleeves. Some lovers ran away together, forging unofficial unions that the church refused to recognize. Others kept their meetings brief and their hopes quiet, knowing that even a shared glance could bring consequences. These were not grand romances, but quiet defiance. Acts of longing carried out beneath layers of fear. When lovers stood before judges, they did not always deny the charges. Some confessed, not in shame, but with a strange kind of pride. They had loved. They had chosen. And even if the world would not bless it, they could not pretend otherwise. Sometimes the court relented. A priest might counsel forgiveness. A fine might replace a harsher sentence. But even then, the record remained, a mark in a ledger, a whisper in the parish book. Love had been noted, weighed, found improper, and yet love persisted. In poems, in songs, in the stubborn beating of hearts that refused to stay silent. No matter how many trials were held, the feelings behind them never vanished. They simply found quieter corners in which to grow. Within the heavy walls of a medieval monastery, life was meant to be orderly, sacred, and still. Hours were divided by the toll of bells, matins at dawn, vespers at dusk. Brothers moved in silence, heads bowed, feet shuffling across stone floors. It was a world designed to subdue the body and elevate the soul. And yet, even here, especially here, desire lingered. Not in loud or scandalous displays, but in quiet struggles beneath woolen robes and whispered prayers. Because the flesh, no matter how tightly disciplined, did not forget it was human. Monasteries were places of learning, prayer, and routine. Young boys entered as novices, some before their voices changed, drawn in by faith or family obligation. Some truly believed this life was their calling. Others had little choice. Second sons without inheritance, or children given to the church as a form of spiritual insurance by pious parents. Once inside, they were immersed in a world of rules, rules about food, sleep, labor, and above all, chastity. Any impulse of the flesh was to be confessed, purged, conquered. But as they grew older, the rules clashed with the reality of their own bodies. Desire didn't need an object to take root. A fleeting thought, an accidental brush of skin during communal labor, the sight of a fellow monk in candlelight. These small moments stirred something that had no name in that context. There were no women, no worldly distractions, and yet temptation remained. Not because the monastery failed in its mission, but because it was filled with people. People who, despite their vows, still dreamed, still remembered, still yearned. The human spirit can be trained, but not erased. Some monks confessed these struggles in detail, ashamed and desperate for peace. Medieval records are filled with such entries, men flagellating themselves, fasting, or isolating to escape thoughts they could not shake. But others found ways to live with their feelings, or even quietly explore them. Letters between monks occasionally hint at deep emotional bonds, sometimes crossing into territory the church would never have condoned. These relationships were rarely acknowledged outright, but they existed. They endured. In the margins of devotional books, messages of affection were scribbled in careful Latin. In the stillness of scriptoriums, a gaze might linger just a moment too long. The church tried to manage this inner war. Writings from the period warned against particular friendships, urging monks to love God above all else. Some monasteries moved monks around frequently to prevent bonds from forming. Others instituted strict separations during sleep or labor, but none of it could fully extinguish the quiet flame of human connection. Desire was not always sexual. It was the hunger for closeness, for comfort, for the warmth of another soul. In the long, cold nights, even the most devout sometimes wished for more than prayer. Monasteries were places of discipline, but they were also places of struggle, where the battle between spirit and flesh was fought not once, but every day. And in that battle, a deeper truth emerged. The sacred and the human were never so far apart. Marriage in medieval Europe was not always a grand affair. There were no diamond rings, no legal documents exchanged before witnesses in candlelit halls. At its most basic, all the church required was mutual consent. Two people, free to marry, could speak their vows aloud, sometimes in a garden, sometimes at a bedside, and be considered husband and wife in the eyes of God. This simplicity made marriage accessible. It also made it dangerous, because what could be done in secret could just as easily become a scandal. Secret marriages, known as clandestine unions, were surprisingly common. A young couple, forbidden by their families to wed, might speak vows in the privacy of a chapel or field. A knight about to leave for war might marry his beloved quietly, without alerting his lord or kin. A servant girl, pregnant and desperate, might press her lover to promise himself to her before God. No witnesses, no feast, just two trembling voices in the dark. These vows were legally binding, but they were also easy to deny. And in a world where status, inheritance, and reputation were everything, the consequences of a secret marriage unraveling could be ruinous. When such unions were discovered, they almost always sparked conflict. Families accused one another of deception. Inheritance claims were challenged. Sometimes a man would deny the marriage outright, especially if the woman had no proof beyond her word. Other times the woman might regret the union, realizing too late that the man she had trusted now held power over her. Ecclesiastical courts were flooded with cases of disputed marriages. Was there consent? Were there witnesses? Had vows been exchanged? And if so, what exactly was said? These trials often turned intimate words into evidence, forcing lovers to recall their most private moments before cold, clerical judges. For women, the cost was almost always higher. A secret marriage that ended in betrayal left her with little recourse. If she bore a child, her future darkened further. The shame of pregnancy without a recognized husband could cut her off from her community, even if she insisted she was wed. Without witnesses, she was often not believed. And the man, unless found guilty of deliberate fraud, usually faced lighter penalties. The church tried to clamp down on clandestine marriages, demanding bans be read in church, urging formal ceremonies, but it never fully succeeded. Love, fear, and desperation always found a way. Yet not all secret unions ended in disgrace. Some were quietly accepted once discovered. A couple might be forgiven, their marriage blessed after the fact, their children deemed legitimate. In rare cases, their act of defiance even inspired admiration. They had loved enough to risk everything. They had bound themselves not for money or title, but for the sake of their own hearts. Still, every secret marriage carried with it the shadow of public shame. In a society obsessed with visibility, anything hidden was suspect, and anything suspect, especially when it involved love, was considered a threat. To be a widow in medieval Europe was to inhabit a strange in-between space. You were neither maiden nor wife. You were set apart, veiled in black, surrounded by rituals of mourning and silence. But unlike other women, you had something rare: freedom. For many, widowhood was the first time they could make choices about their own lives. And with that freedom came the return of something society had long tried to bury: desire. No longer tethered to a husband, a widow was still very much alive. She could feel, she could want, and sometimes she did. The church expected widows to mourn. Modesty, sobriety, chastity, these were the virtues pressed upon them. In sermons and confessions, priests urged them to dedicate the rest of their lives to prayer, charity, or celibacy. The ideal widow was a spiritual figure, cleansed by suffering, uninterested in worldly concerns. But most widows were not ideal. They were human. Some were still young. Many were still healthy. And while grief was real, it did not erase the body. In time, desire returned, not always with fanfare, sometimes with shame, but undeniably present. Remarriage was allowed, even encouraged in certain cases. A widow with land or children might be pressured to take a new husband for the sake of security. But that second marriage, if it happened, was often different from the first. A widow might now choose her partner. She might negotiate her dowry, keep control of her property, or resist unwanted suitors with far more authority than before. She had already fulfilled her duty. She had already played the role of wife. Now, if she sought love or companionship again, it was her decision, at least in theory. And yet, even this agency came under scrutiny. A widow who showed too much joy, who dressed too finely, who laughed in the market, or was seen walking with a man, she could quickly become the subject of gossip. Rumors about widows were rampant. Some said they were cunning, dangerous, quick to seduce, quick to deceive. Others painted them as witches or schemers, especially if they chose not to remarry and managed to live well on their own. A powerful woman without a man unsettled the order of things. And if she still dared to express desire through flirtation, through companionship, through quiet arrangements, the whispers grew louder. Despite the judgment, widows found ways to navigate this strange freedom. Some took lovers in secret. Others lived with male relatives, but ruled the household in all but name. A few even joined religious orders, not from piety alone, but because it gave them space to think, to read, to remember a life that had been theirs once and might still be again. And always, desire lingered, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden beneath layers of mourning cloth, but never quite gone. Because widowhood, for all its sorrow, could also be a doorway. A second life. A return not to youth, but to something deeper. An awareness of what had been lost and what might still be found. There was a time in medieval Europe when love became performance, not just affection, not just longing, but a crafted art, complete with rules, symbols, and gestures. This was the age of courtly love, where knights pledged devotion to unattainable ladies, and passion was wrapped in poetry rather than touch. Songs told of noble yearning, of stolen glances and secret favors, of hearts pierced by arrows of pure desire. But behind all the romantic flair, something more complicated stirred. Because courtly love was never really about union. It was about pretending that love could be perfect, that desire could be noble, that real life could be suspended if only for the space of a verse. The ideal love in these stories was impossible by design. The lady was usually married, the knight sworn to chastity or bound by duty. They were never meant to be together. That was the point. It was the tension, the ache of never having, that gave the love its shape. To suffer for love, to burn silently, to write poems no one would read aloud. These were marks of refinement. A man who could control himself, who could long without demanding, he was praised. And the woman who received such devotion, she was elevated beyond mere wife or mother. She became muse. But courtly love, for all its stylized grace, was not innocent. It toyed with boundaries. It gave men permission to speak of women not as equals, but as prizes, as goddesses, as symbols of virtue or temptation. Women, in turn, learned to navigate the attention, to accept the compliments without accepting the risk. In castles and courts, a lace sleeve might be tied to a knight's lance before battle. A glance might last too long in a garden. These moments rarely led to anything more. They were gestures, flirtation without consequence, fantasy without fulfillment. And yet, not always. Occasionally, the performance slipped, and real feelings emerged. Then the cost could be steep. Courtly love was not for peasants or common folk. It was the language of nobility, of those with the leisure to play with danger. In this world, love was a game with elaborate rules: loyalty, secrecy, patience, letters passed in code, emblems exchanged in tournaments. It all looked beautiful from afar, but for those caught in the web, it could be suffocating. A lady praised in verse might find herself hounded in real life. A knight lauded for restraint might cross the line when no one was watching. Pretending was a delicate art, and not everyone knew how to keep it in balance. Still, courtly love shaped medieval ideas of romance for centuries. Its echoes live on in stories of star-crossed lovers, in the belief that true love must suffer, that longing is somehow purer than fulfillment. It made love into poetry, but it also taught generations to confuse distance with depth, silence with sincerity. And perhaps that is the greatest pretense of all. A kiss in the Middle Ages was not just an act of affection, it was a signal, a contract, sometimes even a confession. In a world governed by rank, ritual, and religion, every gesture had its meaning, and the kiss was among the most carefully watched. You kissed the hand of a noble to show respect, the foot of a priest to show humility, the lips of a beloved to show what exactly? Desire, devotion, or something far more dangerous? Because the truth is, while kissing was everywhere in medieval life, it was also perilous. It could crown a vow or ruin a reputation. In courts of love, a kiss was seen as the first breach of decorum. Not the sin itself, but the door through which sin might follow. It was the moment when words became flesh, when fantasy turned into contact. For that reason, it carried enormous weight. A kiss could mean engagement. In some regions, two people who kissed with intent in front of witnesses were considered bound, even married in the eyes of the church. A reckless moment at a feast, a drunken game in a garden, a bold glance turned action. It could alter lives. Which is why many kisses were stolen, not offered, not permitted, but taken in the cover of darkness and quickly denied if seen. Men, of course, were far freer to give and receive such gestures. A knight kissing a lady's hand in a tourney ground was gallant. A lady kissing a man's cheek in public, however, could ignite scandal. The double standard was sharp and it cut deep. Women were expected to be the keepers of restraint. If a kiss happened, it was often the woman who bore the burden of shame, regardless of who initiated it. Parents warned daughters about kisses. Priests warned their flocks. Books on moral conduct detailed the stages of temptation, how a look led to a smile to a word to a kiss, and the kiss to ruin. And yet, people still kissed. Because even in an age of strict rules, the body found its way. Kisses happened in kitchens, behind chapel walls, on moonlit paths where hay carts had passed. They were sometimes sweet, sometimes awkward, sometimes fierce. They were exchanged between those betrothed and between those who could never be. They were remembered long after they ended, proof that, if only for a moment, the wall between longing and reality had fallen. In poetry and song, the kiss was glorified. It was the spark of romance, the seal of love, the soul speaking through the lips. But in daily life, it was also feared. Because a kiss could not be undone. It lingered in rumor, in breath, in memory. And for many, that memory was enough to change everything. In the flickering quiet of a medieval chamber, tucked behind a curtain or beneath a bundle of cloth, there sometimes lay a book. Not a psalter, not a prayer manual, but something else. Something whispered about, frowned upon, even outlawed. These were the forbidden books. Romances of knights and ladies, tales of seduction cloaked in allegory. Ancient poetry full of metaphor that barely veiled its heat. They were not meant for common eyes, and yet they traveled, hand to hand, castle to convent, market to manor, carrying with them glimpses of a world far more passionate than the one officially sanctioned by the church. Not all of these texts were explicit. Most were coded in the language of longing, allegory, and dream. A swan's neck might represent a curve of flesh. A knight's lance might stand for more than valor. These stories taught readers to look between the lines, to see desire not as chaos, but as narrative, ordered, poetic, and sometimes tragic. The church tried to ban many of them. Monks debated whether certain tales led to sin, but people read them anyway, because they fed something starved, the imagination. For women, especially those educated enough to read, these books became quiet companions. A noble woman trapped in a loveless marriage might retreat to her solar and read about Tristan and Isolde, her heart catching in her throat at the familiar ache. A young novice in a convent might copy out a passage from a love poem, hiding it in the folds of her habit. These were not just entertainments, they were escapes. Fantasies not of wild excess, but of being wanted, seen, known, of a touch that was tender, of a love that broke rules yet felt right. Fantasy, in this world, was both sanctuary and risk. To admit such thoughts aloud could invite scorn, punishment, even exile. So desires were tucked into margins, encoded in embroidery, hummed in song when no one was listening. Even illiterate women found ways to imagine. They listened to traveling storytellers, watched mystery plays, whispered tales to one another over laundry lines and cooking fires. The body might be bound, but the mind could still wander. The church knew the danger. Imagination, left unchecked, led to curiosity. And curiosity was the root of temptation. Better, they thought, to drown it in guilt, to replace every image of passion with one of suffering, every flicker of pleasure with the fire of judgment. But this only made the fantasies more vivid. When denied the world, people built it in their minds. A world where love did not end in shame, where the heart could choose. In the end, these forbidden books left no scars, only echoes. A line remembered, a name repeated, a blush that rose long after the page had turned. In a time that tried to silence desire, fantasy was an act of survival. Celibacy in the medieval world was not simply a personal vow, it was a system of control. For those who took holy orders, abstaining from intimacy was framed as a higher calling, a sacrifice that set them apart. But the idea of abstinence went far beyond monasteries and cloisters. It was preached in pulpits, enforced in doctrine, and used as a tool to regulate the behavior of clergy and laity alike. The church did not just discourage sexual expression, it organized society around its repression. And beneath that discipline was a deep anxiety. That desire, if left unchecked, might undo everything. For priests, celibacy became official law in the Western Church by the 12th century, though enforcement was uneven. Many continued to keep concubines or father children in secret, while bishops looked the other way. But as reform movements took hold, the rules hardened. A priest caught in violation could be defrocked, humiliated, exiled. His lover, if discovered, might face public shaming or worse. The church insisted that to serve God, a man must be free of earthly ties, especially to women. This severing of physical intimacy was meant to elevate him, but in practice, it often led to secrecy, hypocrisy, and quiet suffering. The message extended to the laity as well. Celibacy was expected of widows, of the unmarried, and at times even within marriage, especially during Lent, on holy days, or when a woman was pregnant or menstruating. Sexuality was not to be enjoyed, it was to be endured for the sake of procreation, and even then, it came with caveats. Passion was considered suspect. Pleasure was a sign of weakness. The ideal Christian body was one that remained still, contained, obedient. But desire does not disappear just because it is forbidden. It goes underground. It emerges in dreams, in thoughts, in the language of guilt. People confessed feelings they had never acted on, flagellated themselves for impulses, prayed for purity while trembling in fear of their own bodies. The church created elaborate manuals to diagnose and treat impure thoughts. Entire careers were built on interpreting temptation. Abstinence was not just a rule, it became a way of thinking, a way of dividing the self into parts, the clean and the shameful, the holy and the hidden. Celibacy also served power. A celibate priest had no heirs, no sons to inherit his land, no daughters to marry into rival families. His loyalty was meant to belong entirely to the church. By stripping him of family ties, the institution gained tighter control. This political calculation masked itself in theology, but its effects were concrete. Entire generations of men and women were taught to distrust their own flesh, to believe that holiness required suppression. And yet, even in this world, quiet rebellions occurred. A priest might visit a lover under cover of night. A couple might defy abstinence rules in private, clinging to their bond. Celibacy might have been the ideal, but real people, as always, made room for their humanity. In a world where love could be punishable, desire had to find other doors. And often those doors led not to chapels or confessionals, but to the hearths of midwives, herb women, and cunning folk who knew the old ways. In the shadows of medieval Europe, when prayers seemed too distant and priests too judgmental, many turned to magic, not for curses or revenge, but for love. Love charms, potions, powders, and whispered incantations became part of a hidden language that bridged longing and desperation. It wasn't just superstition, it was survival. The recipes varied by region: a pinch of rosemary, a drop of menstrual blood, a fragment of fingernail mixed into wine. Each had its own purpose. Some were meant to attract a new lover, others to bind an existing one, to renew desire or punish betrayal. Certain spells were inscribed on parchment and worn against the skin. Others were muttered over embers or baked into bread. Folk practitioners claimed they could awaken passion or cool it down, could make a man faithful or soften the heart of a cruel husband. Whether they worked didn't always matter. What mattered was the hope they stirred. These practices were not confined to peasants. Nobles, too, consulted the wise. A lady of the court might ask for a charm to win a knight's attention. A merchant's wife might seek an herb to keep her traveling husband close in spirit, if not in flesh. The boundary between medicine and magic was porous. Aphrodisiacs, fertility tonics, and mood-altering herbs were common. Mandrake root, believed to grow beneath gallows and scream when pulled from the earth, was especially prized. So was mugwort, yarrow, and belladonna, plants that carried both healing and risk. The church condemned these acts harshly. Love magic was considered a grave sin, a manipulation of free will, an affront to divine order. Women who practiced it were labeled witches, seductresses, enemies of the soul. But even priests sometimes found themselves caught in the very nets they condemned. Stories circulated of clergymen undone by the charms of village women, of confessors who warned against sin but could not resist it when sweetened with rosewater and spell work. What these superstitions reveal is how powerless many felt in matters of love. A woman with no dowry, a man with no title, a widow with no suitor, each had little recourse in the formal world. Magic gave them a sense of agency, however fleeting. It allowed them to act when they could not speak, to reach for love when the rules kept it out of reach. In many ways, these spells were not about control. They were about connection. They were about being seen. Not all ended well. A charm might backfire. A potion might sicken. And the consequences of being discovered could be brutal. But still, the practices endured, passed down in whispers, scrawled in margins, handed from one aching heart to another. Because even in a world built on silence and shame, people found ways to express their desire through the language of earth and fire, through the breath between words, through the oldest spell of all, hope. By the late Middle Ages, passion was not merely discouraged, it was watched, tracked, prosecuted. As the church tightened its grip on Europe, the body itself became suspect. What you felt, what you touched, even what you dreamed could draw the attention of powerful men in dark robes. The Inquisition was not just about heresy in the abstract. It was about control, of thoughts, of flesh, of the invisible world inside you. And when it came to love, lust, and longing, the inquisitors did not hesitate to turn whispers into evidence. The inquisitorial courts were never designed to be merciful. They operated on suspicion, confession, and fear. If someone claimed you had seduced them using unnatural means, or that you had broken your vows in secret, or even that you dreamed too vividly, these were enough to summon you. People were encouraged to report each other. Neighbors turned in neighbors. A passing glance, a private joke, a too close friendship could all become fuel for interrogation. And under questioning, innocence became a fragile thing. For women especially, the danger was profound. A midwife who gave herbal remedies might be accused of crafting love potions. A widow who refused to remarry might be suspected of sorcery. A young girl who laughed too freely or wore her hair uncovered might be called lascivious. The Inquisition blurred lines between desire and danger. It assumed that passion, particularly female passion, must be unnatural and therefore punishable. But men, too, were caught in the net. Priests accused of secret liaisons, scholars who wrote too freely about the body, troubadours whose songs hinted at pleasures beyond the bounds of marriage. The inquisitors sought to silence not only actions but thoughts. Books were burned, love poems confiscated, traditions rewritten to scrub away traces of the flesh. The ideal soul was disembodied, sexless, pure. Anything less was heresy. What made the Inquisition so terrifying was its reach. It was not limited to cities or courts. It spread through villages, monasteries, marketplaces. It turned everyday intimacy into potential blasphemy. A married couple expressing too much affection, a lover sneaking into a courtyard, a woman seen bathing alone. All of it could be recast as evidence. The most private moments became dangerous. And yet, the human heart resisted. Even under surveillance, people found ways to connect. Secret rendezvous continued. Letters were smuggled. Glances were shared across the divide of fear. Some even defied the system openly, challenging its authority in poetry, in art, in whispered rebellion. These acts were not just about love. They were about survival, about reclaiming the self from a world that sought to erase it. The Inquisition wanted silence, control, submission. But desire is not so easily destroyed. It survives even in darkness, especially in darkness. And in every forced confession, in every burned letter, there is a trace of that survival, a reminder that passion, however policed, never fully vanishes. In the medieval world, the confessional was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of mercy, repentance, and healing. A sinner knelt in silence while the priest, veiled behind a screen or listening face to face, served as the bridge between their trembling soul and divine forgiveness. But the confessional was never just a place of spiritual reckoning. It was also a theater of power, a space where secrets were exposed, where shame was named, and where desire, especially desire, was interrogated. And behind that solemn ritual lay a current of vulnerability that few spoke about, but everyone felt. Confession was required regularly. The church taught that no soul could remain clean for long, and that even impure thoughts were stains in need of cleansing. People confessed to stealing bread or lying to their masters, but increasingly the focus turned to the body, to lustful dreams, to private acts, to desires barely understood. Manuals for priests grew longer, more detailed, listing every possible sin of the flesh a confessor might need to extract. The questions were pointed. Had you touched yourself? Had you lain with someone outside of marriage? Had you fantasized, even in solitude? And if so, how? How often? And with whom? For many, these questions were deeply humiliating. Yet they answered, sometimes through tears, sometimes with trembling honesty, because to hide a sin was to risk the soul. But the imbalance of the confessional was clear. One side of the screen held shame, the other, power. And not every priest was holy. Some were curious, others exploitative. There are records, quiet, careful, devastating, of confessors who crossed the line, who used confession to manipulate, to abuse, to satisfy their own appetites under the guise of absolution. Women were especially at risk. Alone with a priest, often uneducated and isolated, they confessed intimate things they had never spoken aloud. And sometimes, they were not met with grace, but with hunger. A priest might offer forgiveness in exchange for silence, or something more. He might suggest that their desires were not sinful, but natural, if only shared with him. The Church condemned such actions severely, in theory. But in practice, many cases disappeared. The word of a priest weighed more than the word of a girl from a village no one remembered. Even for honest confessors, the confessional could become a place of torment. Imagine being 16, afraid of the feelings in your chest, and having to describe them in detail to an older man in robes. Imagine carrying the weight of your own confusion and being told that every part of it, every instinct, every flicker, was filthy. Confession did not always cleanse. Sometimes it scarred. Yet people returned, again and again, because there was no other path to forgiveness. The Church had made itself the only bridge between guilt and grace, and in that narrow space, the most human parts of the soul were laid bare, misunderstood, judged, or sometimes quietly forgiven. Medieval Europe loved its extremes. On one end, the saint, pure, pious, chaste beyond human understanding. On the other, the seductress, dangerous, tempting, cloaked in sin. Between these two icons, countless real women lived their lives, caught in a cultural framework that offered them little room to simply be human. Whether celebrated in glowing manuscripts or condemned in sermons from stone pulpits, women were divided by this myth, revered for virtue, reviled for desire. And in both cases, they were seen not as people, but as symbols. The saint was held up as the ideal. Often young, virginal, and quiet, she was praised not for what she did, but for what she resisted. Saints like Agnes, Cecilia, and Catherine were said to have turned away suitors, rejected marriage, and embraced martyrdom rather than compromise their chastity. Their stories were told and retold, not for their courage, but for their control. Pain became proof of their holiness. Starvation, mutilation, even death were framed as triumphs over temptation. The more they suffered, the more they were admired. Their bodies, even in decay, were treated as sacred relics. But underneath the reverence was a chilling message. The best woman is the one who says no to everything. The seductress, by contrast, was vilified. She was Eve reborn, Delilah with a new name. She could be a tavern girl, a noblewoman, a widow, or even a nun who strayed. Wherever she appeared, she was blamed for stirring sin in men's hearts. Preachers warned of her painted lips, her perfumed hair, her eyes that wandered. Her power, they insisted, was not in magic or strength, but in her ability to tempt. To simply be looked at, and looked at willingly, was enough to brand her dangerous. Stories of witches, succubi, and unfaithful wives reinforced this fear. And yet she too was a fantasy, crafted by the same hands that created the saint. In art, these figures were often placed side by side, the saint in white, gazing upward, the seductress in red, eyes half lowered. One was cold and pure, the other warm and corrupt. Neither was real, and both shaped how actual women were treated. A girl who expressed desire might be told she was shameful. A wife who resisted her husband's touch might be praised for her virtue. Women were measured by their proximity to these poles, praised if they could suffer, punished if they dared to feel. And yet, some women refused the roles. They wrote poems about love. They ran businesses. They taught their daughters that desire was not evil, just human. Some even blurred the lines. Holy women who spoke of divine ecstasy in terms that sounded very much like passion. The church tried to control the narrative, but life always leaked through. Because no woman is all saint or all seductress. They are something far more complicated, real. In the medieval imagination, virginity was more than a virtue. It was a kind of power, a fragile, invisible state that could define a woman's worth, her destiny, even her holiness. To be a virgin was to be untouched, sealed, set apart. It carried a strange holiness that hovered somewhere between reverence and control. The cult of virginity, as it came to be known, was not simply about purity. It was about ownership, about who had the right to claim a body, and what it meant when that body remained closed to the world. From the moment a girl was born, the question of her future virginity began to shadow her life. Was she to be married? If so, her virginity became a dowry in itself, something to be guarded, watched over, even inspected. Was she to become a nun? Then her virginity would be offered not to a man, but to God. In both paths, her body was spoken for before she ever had a say, and any deviation, any whisper of premarital contact, even if imagined or falsely accused, could destroy her standing entirely. The church elevated virginity to a sacred state. The Virgin Mary was the model for all women, silent, obedient, and miraculously untouched even in motherhood. Martyrs who died rather than surrender their chastity were canonized. In hagiographies, the act of preserving one's virginity was portrayed as a battle, fought not only against men, but against the devil himself. The girl who withstood temptation became a warrior saint. Her victory was not in living a full life, but in dying with her virginity intact. And yet this ideal was both cruel and contradictory. It created impossible standards. A woman's worth was tied to something that could not be seen or measured, yet was constantly under suspicion. Hymens became metaphors. Bleeding on the wedding night was celebrated. Not bleeding was feared. Midwives were sometimes asked to examine brides in secret. Virginity, that most private of conditions, became public obsession. It also created a hierarchy among women. Virgins were seen as spiritually superior to wives. Wives were superior to widows. And all were seen as less pure than the nuns who locked themselves away from the world entirely. This stratification ensured that women were never simply themselves. They were always in relation to their sexuality, or lack of it. But virginity, for all its symbolic weight, was never just about morality. It was about power. Who gets to say whether a woman is pure? Who benefits from keeping her afraid of her own body? Who profits when she is taught that her highest virtue is in never being touched? These were the real questions that the cult of virginity tried to hide. And still, women found ways to live, to laugh, to love, to remember that beneath the myth, they were flesh and breath and will, not vessels, not metaphors, not myths carved in stone. To the outside world, Monasteries and convents were havens of silence, prayer, and purity, fortresses against the chaos of the flesh. Behind their walls, the soul was said to rise above the body, untouched by the passions that plagued ordinary folk. But the truth, as always, was more human. Monks and nuns were not saints by default. They were people, some devout, some unsure, many struggling in private with the very desires they had vowed to leave behind. And inside those cloisters, beneath the chants and the candlelight, lust did not vanish. It simply took on a quieter form. Young boys and girls were often placed into religious life not by choice, but by family design. A second son who would not inherit land, a daughter whose dowry was too costly. These became monks and nuns. Some embraced the calling. Others never stopped longing for the lives they'd left behind. Within the cloister, they were expected to renounce all forms of intimacy, even friendships that grew too close. But hearts are not so easily disciplined. Bonds formed. Glances lingered. Hands brushed beneath shared blankets in cold dormitories. And sometimes, much more happened. Lust within religious orders was often spoken of in riddles, spiritual temptation, afflictions of the flesh, moments of weakness. But the evidence was clear. Letters between monks and nuns survive, some of them startlingly intimate. Scandals erupted when children were born in cloisters or when secret meetings were uncovered in gardens and storerooms. The church investigated, punished, relocated offenders, but the pattern continued. Because while vows were spoken with solemnity, desire never bowed to ceremony. The architecture of monasteries designed for solitude often made secrecy easier. Hidden passages, divided cells, libraries with shadowed corners, these spaces became meeting grounds for forbidden encounters. Some monasteries were stricter than others. In places where rules were rigorously enforced, even the act of speaking to someone of the opposite sex was considered dangerous, but repression only deepened the hunger. When every thought is policed, a single glance can feel electric. Confessors were expected to guide their fellow brothers and sisters in resisting temptation, but in many cases, the confessors themselves became involved. Power and intimacy made a volatile mix. Nuns in particular were vulnerable to abuse from the priests who were meant to protect their souls. And yet, not all transgressions were predatory. Many were born of mutual yearning, moments of warmth mistaken for sin, or sin mistaken for salvation. What emerged from these stories is not simply scandal. It is a reminder that no wall is high enough to keep the body out. Monastic life was meant to be an escape from earthly desire, but instead it became a mirror, showing that even those who gave up the world could not give up being human. In medieval towns and villages, the line between private life and public scrutiny was razor thin. Every whispered rumor, every stolen glance, and every secret meeting risked exposure, and the consequences could be swift and brutal. When acts of desire, love, or lust were discovered, the community demanded punishment, not just for justice, but as a spectacle to warn others. Public shaming was a key tool in controlling behavior, transforming intimate failings into communal theater. Punishments took many forms, often designed to humiliate and isolate. A woman caught in adultery might be paraded through the marketplace, forced to wear a sign declaring her sin. Men could be whipped or fined, their reputations tarnished in official records. Sometimes offenders were placed in stocks or pillories, wooden frames that immobilized them for hours or days while townsfolk jeered, spat, or threw rotten food. The goal was clear: to make the invisible sin visible, to turn private acts into public shame. Such punishments were often gendered. Women bore the brunt of public disgrace, seen as moral weak links whose transgressions threatened the social order. Their bodies became battlegrounds of control, Husbands might demand fines or physical retribution for a wife's infidelity. Midwives, brothel keepers, or single mothers faced suspicion and exclusion. Men, while punished, often escaped with lesser penalties unless their actions directly challenged family honor or church authority. The church played a central role in these spectacles. Clergy led public penance rituals, forcing sinners to confess before the congregation, kneel in the town square, or carry out acts of contrition. These rituals blurred the lines between spiritual healing and social control. They reaffirmed communal values while reinforcing the power of church and state. The message was loud and clear. Desire was dangerous and must be disciplined. But public punishment was not just about control, it was also a form of communication. It told stories about right and wrong, order and chaos, purity and corruption. It shaped how people thought about love and sex, linking morality to visible behavior. The scars of these punishments lingered long after the pain faded, marking victims with stigma that could affect marriage prospects, social standing, and even survival. Despite the terror of exposure, people continued to love, to desire, to fail. The threat of public punishment made private acts more secretive, but never erased them. In hidden corners, behind closed doors, life went on. Desire persisted, because it is one of the few things human laws cannot fully contain. In a time before hospitals and doctors as we know them today, midwives and healers were the pillars of community health, especially when it came to the intimate and vulnerable matters of sexual and reproductive life. These women held knowledge passed down through generations, a mix of practical experience, herbal wisdom, and traditions often blended with superstition. Trusted by many, feared by some, and sometimes condemned by others, midwives and healers played a crucial role in navigating the mysteries and challenges of medieval sexuality. Childbirth was a dangerous and uncertain event. Most deliveries took place at home, with no physician in sight, and the midwife was the only expert present. She guided women through labor, using her hands, chants, and remedies to ease pain, encourage progress, or deal with complications. Beyond physical support, midwives also provided emotional comfort, advice, and reassurance to expectant mothers. Their knowledge extended to fertility, contraception, and even the treatment of sexually transmitted infections, topics often taboo or shrouded in silence elsewhere. Herbal medicine formed the backbone of their practice. Midwives and healers used plants such as rue to encourage menstruation, willow bark for pain relief, and pennyroyal to induce abortion. These remedies were often powerful and risky, but in a world with limited options, they were sometimes the only hope. Knowledge of these plants was guarded carefully, taught only to trusted apprentices or family members. Their preparation might be accompanied by prayers or spells, reflecting the deep intertwining of medicine and magic. Yet the position of midwives was precarious. While they were indispensable, they were also vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or immorality, especially when outcomes were poor or when their knowledge challenged medical or ecclesiastical authorities. Some were celebrated, even revered. Others were persecuted. Inquisitions and trials sometimes targeted women healers, conflating their practices with heresy or malice. This tension reflected broader anxieties about female agency and control over the body. Midwives and healers also often served as confidants, holding the private stories of women's sexual lives. They heard secrets that others did not, the fears of unwanted pregnancies, the pain of abuse, the hopes for love. In many cases, they were the first and last line of defense for women navigating a world where desire, shame, and survival were tangled together. Their role reminds us that medieval sexuality was not only shaped by law and religion, but also by the intimate, practical knowledge of those who lived it daily. In the hands of midwives and healers, The body was not merely a site of control, but a space of care, resilience, and sometimes quiet rebellion. In the bustling, often harsh world of medieval life, touch was far more than a casual gesture. It was a language, rich with meaning, coded by context, class, and culture. Unlike today's more casual norms, physical contact was governed by an unspoken etiquette that communicated respect, desire, power, or warning. A simple touch could bridge social divides or reinforce them, express intimacy or command distance, and sometimes serve as the only way to speak forbidden feelings. Touch was often carefully controlled, especially between men and women. Public displays of affection were rare and frowned upon, while even familial touch followed strict rules. A handshake or a bow might suffice among strangers or acquaintances. A lingering hand could spark gossip or worse. But within this restraint, subtle forms of communication flourished. Lovers passed secret touches in crowded halls, a brush of a sleeve, a squeeze of the palm, a finger tracing a line just so. These brief moments carried messages impossible to say aloud. The language of touch extended beyond romance. A healer's hands could soothe or provoke. Midwives knew exactly where to press, and priests might lay hands to bless or command. Touch could comfort the sick, calm the fearful, or assert dominance in a society where physical power was a currency. But it could also wound, humiliate, or punish. Whippings and beatings left marks that spoke louder than words. For many, touch was fraught with risk. Women had to navigate unwanted advances, cloaked as greetings or help. Men had to carefully balance displays of strength and tenderness, knowing a misstep could cause offense. Children learned early what was permitted and what was taboo, carrying those lessons into adulthood. The body became a map of these social rules, where to reach, where to withdraw, what could be offered, what must be concealed. Within this intricate system, touch was also an act of rebellion, a secret caress between lovers, a comforting embrace in grief, a daring kiss stolen when no one looked. These acts challenged the rigid order and affirmed the humanity beneath the rules. They reminded people that despite the strictures of society, the need for connection and love could never be fully erased. The secret language of touch was as old as civilization itself, a quiet, powerful thread weaving through medieval life, connecting people in ways words never could. In medieval society, desire was not experienced equally by all. Instead, it was filtered through a lens of double standards that judged men and women very differently, holding women to impossible standards of chastity and submission, while often excusing or even celebrating male passion. This unequal treatment shaped not only behavior, but also the stories told about love, sin, and honor, reinforcing power dynamics that kept the social order intact and the status quo unchallenged. Men were expected to be virile, to pursue women, and even to engage in extramarital affairs with some measure of acceptance, particularly if they were nobles or clergy. A knight's conquests were sometimes seen as signs of prowess, a priest's secret lover, a tolerated weakness. Although public reputation mattered, men often had room to negotiate their desires, and their transgressions were less likely to ruin their social standing. When caught, punishments could be lighter or negotiated through fines and penance. Women, by contrast, bore the burden of chastity as a form of social currency. Their bodies were symbols of family honor and social alliances. A woman's virginity at marriage could secure dowries and land. Her fidelity could maintain peace between families. But if she stepped outside these bounds, through premarital sex, adultery, or even flirtation, she risked not just shame, but ostracism, loss of inheritance, and sometimes violence. The law was harsher and the community less forgiving. A woman's desire was often pathologized as dangerous or unnatural, something to be suppressed rather than understood. This disparity extended into law and theology. Ecclesiastical courts vigorously prosecuted women for sexual sins, while often turning a blind eye to men's indiscretions. Sermons warned women of the perils of lust and the importance of modesty, casting them as temptresses responsible for the fall of men. Meanwhile, men's lust was sometimes portrayed as an uncontrollable force, a test of their strength or a trial to overcome. The double standards affected personal relationships too. Women could be blamed for their husband's infidelity or labeled loose if they showed any sexual agency. Men were rarely questioned about their desires beyond warnings to avoid scandal. This imbalance shaped not only medieval life, but the legacy of attitudes toward gender and sexuality that would echo for centuries. Yet even within this rigid system, women found ways to assert their desires and redefine their roles. Through poetry, subtle resistance, and quiet defiance, they challenged the narrative, claiming space for their own complex humanity in a world that often denied it. The bridal chamber in medieval Europe was a space shrouded in both anticipation and anxiety, a room that symbolized the beginning of marriage and the fulfillment of social and religious duties. Yet behind its closed doors lay a complex world of expectation, fear, and intimate discovery, where the ideal of union often clashed with the realities of two imperfect bodies and minds learning to navigate desire under the weight of tradition. For many brides, the wedding night was less a romantic adventure and more a trial by fire. They were expected to prove their virginity, often through the display of blood-stained sheets or the testimony of witnesses. This ritual, though invasive and fraught with pressure, was seen as essential to validating the marriage and securing inheritance rights. The bridal chamber, therefore, was not just about intimacy, but about honor, legality, and family reputation. The couple themselves might know little of what to expect. Sex was often a taboo subject before marriage. Education about the body was minimal or non-existent. Fear, embarrassment, and silence surrounded the encounter. Husbands might be inexperienced or uncertain, just as wives were. Physical pain was common, as was emotional confusion. Yet amidst the awkwardness, moments of tenderness and connection could emerge, even if unspoken. The bridal chamber was also a place where power dynamics played out. Husbands had legal rights over their wives' bodies, while wives were expected to submit. But this submission did not mean passivity. Women found ways to assert themselves subtly, to refuse, to negotiate, to protect their bodies when possible. Some marriages began with gentle patience, others with conflict. In either case, the first night often set a tone that would shape the relationship. Stories and advice manuals circulated on how to behave in the bridal chamber, blending medical knowledge, religious teaching, and cultural norms. Some urged restraint, others emphasized duty, but all reinforced the idea that this night was a threshold, one that bound two families, two souls, and two bodies in a lifelong contract. Despite the weight of expectation, the bridal chamber was also a place of hope. It was where two lives merged, where love might grow despite all obstacles, and where the private, human experience behind the grand rituals quietly unfolded. In medieval Europe, marriage was less a romantic union and more a transaction conducted in the bustling public arena of the marketplace, the village square, or the family hearth. Behind the ceremonies and church blessings lay the harsh realities of alliances, economics, and social survival. Marriage was a negotiation between families, often driven by property, power, and reputation rather than love. It was a marketplace where daughters were commodities and husbands were investments. The matchmaking process involved careful calculation. Parents, particularly fathers, weighed the benefits of an alliance, the size of a dowry, the value of land or livestock, and the standing of the prospective spouse's family. Marriages could cement peace between feuding clans or expand a family's influence across regions. Sometimes the bride herself had little say, her fate decided long before she could voice a preference. Love, if it appeared at all, was often an afterthought. Negotiations were public and sometimes theatrical affairs. Bans were read aloud in church to announce intended unions, giving the community a chance to object. Markets and fairs became informal venues where families might meet and discuss terms, often in the presence of witnesses to ensure transparency. Contracts were drafted, promises exchanged, and sometimes disputes erupted if expectations were not met. Marriage was a social contract as much as a personal one. The economic aspects were critical. A dowry, a transfer of wealth from the bride's family, was expected to secure the match. It could include money, goods, or land. The groom's family, in turn, promised protection and sometimes a bride price. These exchanges were meticulously recorded and could dictate the stability of the marriage. A failed dowry or a broken promise could lead to public scandal or even legal battles. Yet within this marketplace, human emotions stirred quietly. Amid negotiations, glances were exchanged. Secret hopes and fears hovered beneath the surface. Some marriages blossomed into genuine partnerships, others into quiet misery. And in rare moments, love found a foothold in the most transactional of places. The marketplace of marriage was where public and private collided, a vivid reminder that medieval love lived in the tension between duty and desire, obligation and hope. Servants in medieval households often lived and worked in the shadows, overlooked by the nobility they served and forgotten by history's grand narratives. Yet beneath the polished silver and embroidered gowns of their masters, servants led rich, complicated lives full of desire, secret romances, and survival strategies. Bound by class, but driven by human needs, their stories reveal a side of medieval sexuality that was messy, hidden, and far from the idealized versions told in castles and cathedrals. Living in close quarters with their employers, servants experienced a constant tension between duty and temptation. Kitchens, chambers, and corridors became spaces where forbidden glances turned into stolen kisses, and whispered confessions blossomed into clandestine liaisons. Some servants formed relationships with each other, across gender and age, while others became entangled with their masters or guests. These relationships were fraught with risk. A servant caught in an affair could be dismissed, punished, or worse. Despite their low status, servants exercised a surprising degree of agency within these confines. They negotiated marriages, managed pregnancies in secret, and created networks of support that stretched across households. Midwives and healers among them provided essential knowledge about contraception, childbirth, and disease. The boundaries between professional roles and personal lives often blurred, making the servant class both vulnerable and resilient. The double standards applied here were stark. A lord's dalliance might be overlooked or celebrated, while a servant's similar actions led to ruin. Yet servants also wielded subtle power through gossip, access to secrets, and their indispensable labor. They could shape reputations and influence outcomes in ways that made nobles wary. Their stories remind us that medieval sexuality was not confined to the privileged few. Desire, love, and survival wove through every social stratum, and even in the darkest corners of great houses, the human heart found ways to beat loudly, defiantly, and sometimes joyfully. In medieval society, reputation was currency. It dictated your place in the community, your prospects for marriage, your ability to trade, and often your very survival. Reputation was fragile, especially when it came to matters of sex and virtue, where a single whispered accusation could unravel a life. The price paid for maintaining or losing one's good name was steep, and the consequences reached far beyond personal embarrassment. Honor was tied to families, alliances, and social order, making the stakes intensely high. For women, reputation was especially precarious. A girl's worth was measured by her chastity and a wife's by her fidelity. Rumors of infidelity, flirtation, or impropriety could lead to ostracism, loss of dowry, or worse. Mothers cautioned daughters to guard their words and gestures, teaching them that even a careless glance could be interpreted as invitation. For noble families, a daughter's sullied reputation could jeopardize political alliances. For peasants, it could mean being shunned at the market or denied help in hard times. Men faced their own pressures, though the rules were different. Their reputation rested more on honor, courage, and lineage than on sexual purity. Still, scandal could damage a man's standing, particularly if it involved betrayal, illegitimacy, or failure to protect family honor. Noblemen risked political fallout, while commoners might suffer physical violence or social exclusion. Gossip was a powerful weapon wielded by neighbors, rivals, and even family members eager to settle scores. Reputation was maintained not only through behavior, but through public rituals, marriage, baptism, confession, and penance that reaffirmed one's standing. Breaking these social contracts invited punishment designed to restore order and deter others. The community acted as judge, jury, and executioner, holding the collective power to forgive or condemn. This intense scrutiny shaped medieval sexuality profoundly. Desire had to be hidden or controlled. Love was often circumscribed by social expectations rather than personal feelings, and the fear of ruin forced many into silence, secrecy, and sometimes despair. Yet, reputation was also a form of power. Those who controlled their image could gain influence and respect, and even those cast out might find ways to rebuild, resist, or redefine themselves. The price of reputation was high, but so was its value in a world where survival depended on being seen as worthy. Marriage in medieval Europe was a carefully constructed agreement, sealed not just by vows and ceremonies, but by intricate contracts that defined the rights, duties, and expectations of both parties. These contracts were legal documents that went beyond the simple promise of love, embedding clauses that could dictate property, inheritance, dowries, and even intimate matters. Far from being mere formalities, these contracts shaped the private lives of couples and the fate of families for generations. Often negotiated by families rather than the bride and groom themselves, marriage contracts were drafted with precision. They specified the size and nature of the dowry, which could include land, money, livestock, or goods. In some cases, the contracts included clauses about the management of property if the husband died or the wife was widowed. The language was legalistic, emphasizing obligation and compensation rather than affection. But some contracts delved into more personal territory. Hidden clauses could outline the expected behavior of spouses, including provisions about fidelity, conjugal duties, and even the timing or frequency of sexual relations. While these details might seem intrusive or strange today, they were vital in a society where marriage was primarily an economic and political alliance. Ensuring heirs were produced was a priority, and contracts sometimes stipulated penalties or consequences if certain conditions were not met. These agreements also reflected social tensions. Wives might negotiate protections against abandonment or mistreatment, while husbands sought assurances of dowry repayment if a marriage dissolved. Contracts were tools of negotiation, reflecting power dynamics within families and communities. Sometimes disputes arose over breaches of contract, leading to legal battles or church interventions. The complexity of these documents reveals how intertwined marriage was with law, economics, and social order. They show a world where intimacy was not merely a private matter, but a public legal affair. And beneath the formal language lay the hopes, fears, and struggles of people trying to secure their futures in an uncertain world. Amid the strictures of medieval life, where rules governed the body, desire was surveilled, and daily toil dominated, there existed moments of release, rebellion, and rare freedom. Festivals and feasts were these moments. When the community gathered to celebrate religious holidays, harvests, or special occasions, the usual boundaries softened. The long tables groaned with food and drink, music filled the air, and for a brief time, the burdens of shame and control lifted, allowing hidden pleasures to surface. These gatherings were not merely about food and ceremony. They were spaces where social roles could be playfully inverted, where the rigid hierarchy blurred under the glow of firelight and the warmth of ale. Masks and costumes allowed people to slip into different identities. Dancing broke the formal posture of everyday life. Jokes, songs, and stories, some bawdy, some sacred, spread through crowds, carrying whispered messages and risque humor that might never be spoken openly at other times. In the revelry, flirtations sparked and sometimes blossomed. A stolen glance across the hall, a hand brushed accidentally or on purpose, a whispered compliment in the din. These moments held the thrill of secrecy and danger. Lovers might find each other in the shadowed corners or the moonlit fields beyond the village. The feasts were the backdrop for courtships that defied parental plans and community gossip. They were the times when the pulse of life quickened and the mind could dream beyond daily hardships. Yet these pleasures were always fleeting and fraught with risk. Excess could lead to disorder, accusations, or punishment once the feast ended and order was restored. The church condemned drunkenness and licentiousness, warning that such behavior endangered the soul. Still, the appetite for celebration and connection was undeniable. Festivals served as safety valves, a way for communities to acknowledge human desire while containing it within prescribed limits. In these moments, medieval people were not just subjects of rigid morality, but complex individuals, capable of laughter, longing, and joy. The hidden pleasures of festivals and feasts remind us that beneath the layers of shame and control lay a persistent human spirit yearning to be free. Medieval life was shadowed by the ever-present realities of loss. Loss of loved ones, of youth, of security, and often of hope. Yet within this fragile existence, love endured as a force that shaped not only individuals, but entire families and communities. It was a complicated love, marked by duty and desire, joy and pain, fleeting moments of happiness alongside the harsh weight of grief. Through love, people sought connection, continuity, and a kind of immortality beyond the limits of their mortal lives. Marriages united families and secured legacies, but they also bound people emotionally. Husbands and wives shared the daily struggles of survival, raising children, managing lands, and enduring the unpredictable blows of famine, war, and disease. Letters and poems from the period reveal real affection, longing during separation, tenderness and care, sorrow and loss. Widows and widowers often remarried, sometimes for alliance, sometimes for companionship, illustrating the human need for connection despite pain. Loss was never far from love. Death was a constant visitor, claiming young and old with equal disregard. The plague, wars, and childbirth took countless lives, leaving behind grieving families and empty homes. Mourning rituals gave shape to grief, but they also served to reaffirm the bonds that death could not sever. Memorials, prayers, and tombs kept memories alive, reinforcing the belief that love transcended even the grave. Legacy was woven into these acts of love and loss. Families sought to preserve their name and property through heirs, while individuals hoped their stories would be remembered. The desire to be remembered, to leave a mark, influenced choices in marriage, faith, and even behavior. It was a powerful motivator in a world where life was fragile. In the end, medieval love was not a simple story of passion or romance. It was a complex dance with mortality, shaped by the forces of society, but deeply human at its core. It was a testament to resilience, the enduring need to love, to mourn, and to be remembered.